They said Garrett Hale died the day his wife and son were buried. His body just forgot to follow them into the ground. For 5 years, no woman in Silver Ridge could break through the wall of grief he'd built around his heart. Not the preacher's daughter with her Sunday pies, not the widow Morrison with her gentle eyes, not a single soul, until the day a stranger stepped off that dusty stagecoach, laughed like she owned the world, and made the impossible happen. Before we dive into this tale of heartbreak and redemption, I want you to stay with me until the very end, and when you do, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back to 1877 Colorado, where love was the last thing anyone expected. The late afternoon sun hung low over Silver Ridge, Colorado, painting the mountains in shades of crimson and gold that would have taken a man's breath away, if that man still had breath to give. Garrett Hale stood motionless on the weathered porch of his ranch house, one boot propped against the railing, arms crossed over his chest like he was guarding something precious that no longer existed. The wind carried the scent of pine and coming rain, but he didn't notice. Hadn't noticed much of anything in 5 years. 5 years, 2 months, and 16 days, to be exact. Not that he was counting. The ranch sprawled out before him, 200 acres of prime grazing land that his father had carved out of wilderness that Garrett had expanded with his own bleeding hands, and that now felt like nothing more than an elaborate tomb. Cattle dotted the distant fields, moving slowly in the golden light. His foreman, old Pete Corrigan, was driving a small herd toward the southern pasture, his weathered form barely visible against the landscape. Everything was running smoothly, efficiently, perfectly. And Garrett felt absolutely nothing. "Boss," the voice cut through his thoughts like an axe through kindling. "Boss, you planning on standing there all day, or you gonna help us fix that fence line before dark?" Garrett's eyes shifted to the young ranch hand jogging toward him, Tommy Henderson, barely 20, full of energy and opinions that nobody asked for. The kid had been working the ranch for 8 months now and still hadn't learned that Garrett Hale wasn't a man who appreciated small talk. "Fence can wait," Garrett said, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't speak much these days, didn't see the point. "Wait?" Tommy pulled up short, confusion spreading across his sunburned face. "But you said this morning—" "I know what I said." Garrett's tone didn't rise, didn't sharpen. It didn't have to. Something in the flat, dead quality of it made Tommy step back. "Do it tomorrow." The young man opened his mouth, thought better of it, and nodded. "Yes, sir." He turned and headed back toward the barn, shaking his head. Garrett watched him go with the same empty expression he wore for everything these days. He knew what they said about him in town. Knew the whispers that followed him down Main Street on the rare occasions he ventured off his property. Poor Garrett Hale. Lost his wife and baby boy to the fever. Never been the same since, like a ghost in his own skin. They weren't wrong. The fever had come in the winter of 1872, sweeping through Silver Ridge like the angel of death itself. Started with the miners, spread to the town, and by the time it reached the outlying ranches, there was no stopping it. Sarah had been strong, healthy, full of life, laughing one day, burning with fever the next. Their son, barely 6 months old, had followed her into darkness within 48 hours. Garrett had buried them on a hillside overlooking the ranch, under a spreading oak tree where Sarah used to sit and read while he worked. He'd carved their headstones himself, every letter a small act of dying. And when he'd walked back down that hill, something essential had stayed behind in that raw earth. The man who'd loved to laugh, who'd swept his wife into spontaneous dances in the kitchen, who'd sung off-key lullabies to his infant son, that man was gone. In his place stood this hollow thing, going through the motions of living because he didn't know how to do anything else. "Mr. Hale?" Garrett's jaw tightened. If one more person tried to talk to him today. But when he turned, it wasn't another ranch hand. It was Maria Rodriguez, his housekeeper, standing in the doorway with that look she got when she was about to say something he didn't want to hear. Maria had worked for his parents before they passed, had been there when he'd brought Sarah home as a bride, had helped deliver his son. She was one of the few people in Silver Ridge who still treated him like a human being instead of a tragic curiosity. "What is it, Maria?" "There's a social at the church Sunday evening," she said, her accent softening the words. Reverend Potter asked me to invite you. No. He said there will be I said no. Maria sighed, a sound that contained 5 years of frustration. Garrett, you cannot hide on this ranch forever. You are not yet 40 years old. You have a whole life ahead of you. Had a life, he corrected flatly. Don't need another one. Dios mío, she muttered, crossing herself. What would Sarah say if she could see you like this? The words hit like a physical blow, and for just a moment something flickered behind Garrett's eyes, pain, anger, something alive. But it died as quickly as it sparked. Sarah's not here to say anything, and I'd appreciate it if you'd remember that. He walked past her into the house, leaving Maria on the porch, shaking her head and murmuring prayers in Spanish. Inside, the house was immaculate. Maria made sure of that, but it felt like a museum. The furniture was the same. The curtains Sarah had sewn still hung in the windows. Her favorite chair sat by the fireplace, and sometimes in his weaker moments, Garrett caught himself looking at it, expecting to see her there with her needlework. But the chair was always empty. He poured himself a whiskey, not his first of the day, wouldn't be his last, and stood at the window, staring out at nothing. This was his life now. Work until exhaustion, drink until sleep, wake up and do it again. No joy, no pain, just the endless gray of existence. The sound of hoofbeats drew his attention. A rider was approaching, moving fast. Garrett recognized the horse before he recognized the rider. It was Doc Patterson's bay mare. The doctor rarely came out to the ranch unless someone was hurt. Garrett was outside before the doctor finished dismounting. What happened? Nothing on your ranch, Doc Patterson said quickly, reading the sudden alertness in Garrett's expression. Even hollowed out, his protective instincts for his men remained sharp. But I've got news from town I thought you should hear. Stagecoach just arrived. Brought someone new. Don't care about new arrivals, Doc. You might care about this one. The older man's eyes held something that might have been amusement. Woman named Clara Wynne inherited old Judith Brennan's hat shop. Apparently Judith was her aunt. Nobody in town knew she had family back east. Garrett took a drink. Still don't care. She's different, Garrett. Already got half the town talking. Walked right up to Mayor Hutchins and told him his wife's hat was 5 years out of fashion and she could fix it. Bold as brass. Good for her. Garrett turned back toward the house. Just thought you should know, Doc Patterson called after him. New faces tend to shake things up in small towns. Thought you might want to avoid Main Street for a few days if you're not in the mood for curiosity. Garrett didn't respond, just climbed the porch steps and disappeared inside. Doc Patterson watched him go, shook his head sadly, and mounted up. Some men grieved and moved on. Some men grieved and built walls. And then there was Garrett Hale, who'd grieved and become a wall himself. Sunday came whether Garrett wanted it to or not. He'd planned to spend the day like he spent every Sunday, checking the fence lines, reviewing the books, avoiding town and especially avoiding church. But Pete had other ideas. Boss, we got a problem. The foreman appeared at the barn where Garrett was mucking stalls, work he didn't need to do himself, but it kept his hands busy and his mind empty. That fence line by Willow Creek, 3 posts down, wire torn. Looks like something big came through, maybe a bear, maybe just rot. But it needs fixing today, or we'll have cattle wandering into Johnson's property by tonight. Garrett stabbed the pitchfork into the hay with more force than necessary. Johnson's ranch bordered his to the east, and while they weren't enemies, they weren't exactly friends either. Fine. Get Tommy and take care of it. Tommy's in town. It's Sunday, remember? You gave the boys the afternoon off. He had. It was one of his father's old rules. A man works hard 6 days, he gets his 7th to rest. Even in his current state, Garrett honored that. What about the others? Rodriguez took his wife to visit her sister. Murphy and Jacobs went fishing. It's just me, and I can't handle 3 posts alone. Not at my age. Pete gave him a meaningful look. Which means it's you and me, boss. Or you could ride into town, round up some of the boys. The idea of going to town, of facing the stares and whispers, of having well-meaning townspeople corner him with casseroles and sympathy made Garrett's skin crawl. We'll do it ourselves. Get the tools. They rode out to Willow Creek in silence. Pete knew better than to try conversation. and spent the next 3 hours in hard labor. The posts had rotted through, weakened by last winter's flooding, and replacing them was backbreaking work. By the time they finished, the sun was starting its descent, and Garrett was exhausted in that good physical way that helped him sleep. "We got one more problem," Pete said as they loaded the tools back onto the pack horse. "What now?" "Need supplies from town. Wire clippers broke and we're out of staples for the fencing. Won't be able to continue repairs tomorrow without them." Garrett looked at the sky, calculating. It was past 4 o'clock. Most of the town would be at the church social by now, exactly where he didn't want to be. But Henderson's Mercantile stayed open until 6 on Sundays, and Jim Henderson was a practical man who understood ranching. He could slip in, get what they needed, and slip out before anyone noticed. "I'll go," he said. Pete's eyebrows rose. "You sure? I can go in the morning." "Need them tonight if we're working tomorrow." It was a weak excuse. They could easily wait, but Pete was smart enough not to push. "All right, boss. Want company?" "No." The ride into Silver Ridge took 40 minutes. The town had grown in the 5 years since Garrett had last paid attention. New buildings, new faces, new everything. The population had swelled from a few hundred to nearly 1,000, thanks to the silver mines bringing in workers and their families. Progress, people called it. Garrett called it noise. He tied his horse outside Henderson's Mercantile and was relieved to see the store nearly empty. Just Jim behind the counter and old Mrs. Kowalski examining bolts of fabric in the corner. Perfect. "Garrett Hale," Jim said with genuine surprise. "Didn't expect to see you today." "Need wire clippers and fencing staples? Large box." Sure. Jim moved with efficient speed, gathering the items. "Heard you lost some fence line out by Willow Creek. Word travels. Always does in small towns." Jim wrapped the items in brown paper. "That'll be $3.20. Garrett paid in cash and was turning to leave when Mrs. Kowalski's wavering voice stopped him. "Garrett Hale, is that you?" He closed his eyes briefly, gathering patience he didn't have. "Mrs. Kowalski." "My goodness, I haven't seen you in an age. How are you managing out there all alone? Such a tragedy, your poor Sarah and little—" "I'm fine. Thank you." He headed for the door. "You should come to the church social. There are several lovely young ladies who would be delighted to—" The door closed behind him, cutting off whatever matchmaking scheme she'd been about to propose. Garrett stood on the boardwalk, breathing hard, his hands clenched around the package. Why couldn't people just leave him alone? He didn't want their pity, didn't want their setups, didn't want anything except to be left in peace with his memories and his whiskey. The sound of laughter, bright, genuine, uninhibited, cut through his thoughts. Garrett's head turned before he could stop himself, following the sound. Across the street, outside what used to be Judith Brennan's hat shop, stood a woman he'd never seen before. She was laughing at something the blacksmith's wife was saying, her whole face lit up with joy. Not the polite, careful laughter of women at church socials, but real, unguarded delight. She was striking, not beautiful in the conventional sense, but arresting. Tall, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical style that was already coming loose in the wind. Her dress was well made, but travel-worn, suggesting she'd come from somewhere far away, and the journey had been long. But it was her bearing that caught his attention, the way she stood, straight-backed and confident, like a woman who'd faced hardship and come through it stronger. Clara Wynne. Had to be. The new arrival Doc Patterson had mentioned. As if sensing his stare, she looked up. Their eyes met across the dusty street. For a moment, Garrett forgot how to breathe. Her eyes were green, not the muddy hazel that passed for green, but true, vivid green like new grass after rain. And they looked at him without pity, without curiosity, without any of the things he'd come to expect. Just a simple, direct gaze that seemed to see him as a man, not a tragedy. Then she smiled. Not at him, specifically, just smiled because smiling seemed to be her natural state. The expression transformed her face from striking to luminous. Something twisted in Garrett's chest, sharp and unwelcome. He tore his gaze away and headed for his horse, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He didn't need this. Didn't need some newcomer with pretty eyes and a bright smile disturbing the careful numbness he'd cultivated. But as he rode out of town, he couldn't stop himself from looking back once. She was still there, still laughing, still lit up like a lantern in the growing dusk. Garrett swore under his breath and kicked his horse into a gallop. The next 2 weeks passed in their usual pattern. Work, whiskey, restless sleep filled with dreams he tried to forget. Garrett threw himself into ranch business with even more intensity than usual, driving himself and his men hard enough that Pete finally pulled him aside. "Boss, we need to talk." "We're talking." "About your pace. You're running us ragged, and it's barely spring. If you keep this up, the men will be too exhausted to handle summer work." Garrett was repairing a saddle, his hands moving with practiced precision. "They're cowboys. Cowboys work hard. There's work. And then there's what you're doing, trying to exhaust yourself into not thinking." Pete's weathered face was concerned. "I've known you since you were a boy, Garrett. I know when something's eating at you." "Nothing's eating at me." "Then why did you skip town 3 times this week when you had legitimate business there? Why'd you send Tommy to pick up supplies when you always do it yourself? What are you avoiding?" Not avoiding anything. But even as he said it, Garrett knew it was a lie. He'd been carefully planning his days to ensure he wouldn't run into that woman again. Clara Wynne. The name alone made something uncomfortable shift in his chest. "It's about that new lady, isn't it?" Pete's voice was knowing. "The one with the hat shop." Garrett's hands stilled on the leather. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Course you do. Whole town's talking about her. She's got style, got backbone. Already turned down 3 marriage proposals. Can you believe that? 3 in 2 weeks. Told Mayor Hutchins' nephew she didn't travel all this way just to trade one set of chains for another." Despite himself, Garrett felt a corner of his mouth twitch. "She said that?" "And more. She's got opinions, that one. Told Reverend Potter that his sermons would be more effective if he spoke less about hellfire and more about how to actually help your neighbor. Half the church elders nearly had apoplexy." Pete chuckled. "I like her. Town needs someone who's not afraid to shake things up." Garrett returned to his work, his movements stiff. "Good for her. Doesn't concern me." "Maybe it should." Pete's voice went soft. "Garrett, nobody expects you to forget Sarah, but she wouldn't want you living like this, half dead, barely existing. You're 40 years old. You got a good ranch, good health, years ahead of you. Don't waste them." "I'm not having this conversation." Garrett stood abruptly, throwing the saddle over the rack with enough force to make it shake. "You want something to do? Check the irrigation system. Spring runoff will be starting soon." Pete sighed but didn't push further. He knew when Garrett had hit his limit, but the seed had been planted, whether Garrett wanted to acknowledge it or not. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't stop thinking about what Pete had said. About Clara Wynne turning down proposals because she valued her freedom. About her telling the Reverend how to do his job. About her standing on that street, laughing like she had every right to be happy. When had he last felt anything resembling happiness? Not since Sarah. Not since holding his son for the first and last time. 5 years of gray existence, of going through motions, of feeling nothing because feeling anything meant feeling the crushing weight of loss. But that moment when Clara's eyes met his, just for a second, he'd felt something. Not happiness exactly, more like recognition, like some dormant part of him had lifted its head and noticed the world still existed. He hated it. Garrett rolled over, pulling the pillow over his head, and willed himself to sleep. The town's spring festival was an annual tradition that Garrett normally avoided like the plague. But this year, he had no choice. The Cattlemen's Association meeting was being held the same day, and as one of the largest ranch owners in the county, his presence was expected. Pete had reminded him 3 times, and even Maria had laid out his good shirt with a pointed look that said she'd personally drag him to town if necessary. So here he was, standing in the town square on a Saturday afternoon, surrounded by people celebrating the end of winter. Streamers hung between buildings. Children ran wild with hoops and sticks. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. And everywhere, were people. Talking, laughing, embracing life in ways that Garrett had forgotten existed. "Garrett, over here!" Mayor Hutchins waved from the meeting hall doorway. The meeting was mercifully brief. Discussion of grazing rights, water access, and the possibility of pooling resources for a new breeding bull. Garrett contributed when asked, stayed silent otherwise, and was reaching for his hat to leave when Hutchins stopped him. "Before you disappear, there's someone I'd like you to meet, or rather, properly meet." The mayor's eyes twinkled with something that made Garrett immediately suspicious. Come on. Hutchins, I'm not interested in. This is business, Hale. Purely business. That was how Garrett found himself being led across the square toward the hat shop. His stomach tightened with something between dread and anticipation. Through the shop window, he could see her, Clara Wynne, showing a customer various hat designs, her hands moving expressively as she spoke. The bell over the door chimed as they entered. The shop was transformed from Judith Brennan's dusty, cluttered space into something elegant and organized. Hats of every style lined the shelves, and there was a subtle sophistication to the displays that spoke of experience and refined taste. Clara looked up, and again, Garrett felt that strange jolt when her green eyes found his. But she showed no particular recognition, just the pleasant, professional expression of a shopkeeper greeting potential customers. Mayor Hutchins, how lovely to see you again, and you've brought a friend. Miss Wynne, may I present Mr. Garrett Hale. He owns one of the largest ranches in the county. Garrett, this is Miss Clara Wynne, late of Boston. Mr. Hale. She extended her hand without hesitation, the gesture natural and confident. Garrett stared at her hand for a moment too long, caught off guard by her directness. Most women in Silver Ridge treated him like a wounded animal, careful, cautious, afraid of triggering some unpredictable reaction. But Clara Wynne offered her hand like it was the most normal thing in the world. He took it. Her palm was warm, her grip firm. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt like longer. When he released her hand, his fingers tingled. Ma'am, he managed, his voice rougher than intended. I'm glad you stopped by, actually, Clara said, turning to the mayor. I wanted to thank you for recommending me to Mrs. Patterson. She's commissioned 3 hats already. You do excellent work, Hutchins said, which is exactly why I brought Mr. Hale here. His ranch— I don't need a hat, Garrett interrupted. No, but you employ 15 men who work outdoors year-round, the mayor continued smoothly. Miss Wynne has proposed creating practical, durable hats specifically designed for ranch work, proper protection from sun and rain, built to last. I thought you might be interested in outfitting your men. Garrett looked at Clara, who met his gaze evenly. I grew up around working men, Mr. Hale. My father managed a shipping company in Boston. I know the difference between decorative fashion and practical gear. I'm not trying to sell you fancy city hats. I'm trying to build a business on quality and utility. There was no flirtation in her tone, no calculated charm, just straightforward business sense. Despite himself, Garrett was intrigued. What kind of hats? May I show you? At his nod, she moved to a workbench at the back of the shop and returned with a hat unlike anything he'd seen. It was wider brimmed than standard hats, with a leather band that looked like it could withstand weather, and the construction was clearly meant for durability rather than style. Wider brim for better sun protection, reinforced crown to maintain shape, treatment on the felt to repel water, and a chin strap for when the wind picks up. Garrett took the hat, examining it with a critical eye. The craftsmanship was excellent, far better than the cheap hats most ranch hands bought and replaced every few months. How much? For bulk orders, I can do $3 each. That's less than what they'd pay for inferior hats in Denver. It was a fair price. More than fair. Garrett turned the hat over in his hands, looking for flaws and finding none. This woman knew what she was doing. I'll think about it. Of course. Clara took the hat back without any sign of disappointment. If you'd like to bring one of your men by for fitting, I can customize the design based on his input. I want to make sure they'll actually work for your needs. I said I'll think about it. And I said of course. Her tone was pleasant but firm, making it clear she wasn't going to beg for his business. Somehow, that made Garrett respect her more. Mayor Hutchins beamed, oblivious to the tension. Well, I'll leave you two to discuss details. Miss Wynne, always a pleasure. Garrett, I'll see you at next month's meeting. And then he was gone, and Garrett was alone in the shop with Clara Wynne, feeling distinctly uncomfortable for reasons he couldn't articulate. You don't have to buy anything, Mr. Hale, Clara said, moving back behind her counter. I appreciate the introduction, but I don't expect charity. Wasn't planning on charity. He set his own hat back on his head. If I buy, it'll be because the product's worth buying. That's all I ask. She smiled, That same bright, unshadowed smile he'd seen from across the street. Though I should warn you, I'm quite confident the product is worth buying. I don't do anything halfway. There was pride in her voice, but it was earned pride, not arrogance. Garrett found himself studying her more carefully. She was older than he'd first thought, late 20s, maybe early 30s, old enough to have lived, to have faced disappointments. Yet there was no bitterness in her expression, no hardness. How did someone maintain that kind of openness, that kind of light? I should go, he said abruptly. Of course. Thank you for stopping by, Mr. Hale. He made it to the door before her voice stopped him. Mr. Hale, for what it's worth, I lost someone too. Different circumstances, but loss is loss. I understand why you might want to be left alone. Garrett's hand froze on the door handle. He turned slowly, searching her face for pity or manipulation. Found neither. Just simple, matter-of-fact empathy. The mayor told you about me. The mayor tells everyone about everyone. It's apparently his primary function. A wry smile touched her lips. But you don't have to worry. I'm not here to fix you or save you or whatever well-meaning people try to do. I'm just here to run a business and live my life. If you want to buy hats, buy hats. If you don't, don't. Either way, I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. She turned back to her work, dismissing him without dismissing him. It was the strangest interaction Garrett had experienced in years. Most people either avoided him or tried too hard. Clara Wynne did neither. She simply existed in her space and allowed him to exist in his. He left without another word, but as he untied his horse, he looked back at the shop window. Clara was bent over her workbench, already absorbed in her craft. The afternoon sun caught the copper in her hair, and for just a moment, Garrett let himself notice that she was beautiful. Then he mounted up and rode away, telling himself he wouldn't come back, knowing it was probably a lie. 3 days passed. Garrett worked, drank, slept. The hat commission should have slipped from his mind entirely. It didn't. On Thursday morning, he found himself riding into town with a weak excuse about needing leather straps from the tannery. Pete gave him a knowing look but said nothing. Tommy offered to come along and was refused. And somehow, Garrett's route through town took him past the hat shop. He didn't stop, just rode by slowly enough to see her through the window, laughing with a customer. That laugh again, like wind chimes, like water over stones, like something he'd forgotten existed. Friday, he invented a need to discuss grain prices with Henderson. The mercantile was 2 doors down from the hat shop. He could hear her voice through the open window, speaking to someone about satin versus silk linings. Saturday, he gave up pretending. The shop was empty when he walked in, just Clara at her workbench, surrounded by bolts of fabric and spools of ribbon. She looked up, registered his presence without surprise, and set down her scissors. Mr. Hale, changed your mind about the hats? Maybe. Need to test one first. The lie came easily. You said something about bringing a man by for fitting. I did. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron. Did you bring someone? Thought I'd try it myself. I work the ranch same as my men. It wasn't entirely untrue. Garrett did work alongside his ranch hands, something he'd continued even after inheriting the place. But testing the hat himself when he could have sent Tommy? That was transparent enough to make Clara's eyes glint with something that might have been amusement. Of course, please sit. She gestured to a chair near the workbench. Garrett sat, feeling ridiculous and stubborn in equal measure. Clara retrieved the prototype hat and approached him. This close, he could smell her perfume, something light and floral that reminded him of Sarah's garden in spring. The thought should have sent him running. Instead, he sat frozen as Clara reached out to remove his current hat. May I? He nodded, not trusting his voice. Her fingers brushed his hair as she lifted the old hat away, and Garrett's entire body went rigid. He couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him with such casual intimacy. Maria occasionally patted his shoulder. Pete clapped his back when he'd done something right. But this was different. Deliberate but innocent, professional but personal. Clara set his hat aside and lifted the prototype. Now, let me see how this fits. She placed it on his head, adjusting the position, her face creased in concentration. The crown sits a bit high, and the brim might need to be a 1/4 inch wider for your face shape. My face shape? Everyone's face is different, Mr. Hale. A good hat should complement the wearer's features while serving its function. She stepped back, studying him with an artist's critical eye. The brim needs to be wide enough to shade your face, but not so wide it catches the wind. The crown needs to sit properly without being so tight it gives you headaches after a full day's wear. She reached out again, adjusting the angle, and Garrett found himself holding his breath. This close, he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, the faint freckles across her nose, the small scar at the corner of her mouth that made him wonder what story it held. "There," she said softly. "That's better. How does it feel?" "Fine," he managed. "Feels fine." "Stand up. Walk around. I need to see how it moves with you." Garrett stood, feeling absurdly self-conscious. He walked to the window, turned, walked back. The hat sat perfectly, comfortable, secure, exactly the kind of practical gear his men needed. "It's good," he said. "Quality work." "Thank you." Clara took the hat back, making notes on a piece of paper. "If you want to outfit your men, I can have 15 ready in 3 weeks, sooner if you need them urgently." 3 weeks is fine." He pulled out his wallet. "What's the deposit?" "Half now, half on delivery. That's $22.50. He counted out the money, their fingers brushing again as he handed it over. This time, Clara's eyes met his, and for a moment something passed between them. Recognition, awareness, possibility. Then she pulled back, tucking the money into her cash box with brisk efficiency. "I'll need to see your men for proper sizing. Can you bring them by, or should I come to the ranch?" The thought of Clara at his ranch, in the space that still felt like Sarah's territory, sent a bolt of something painful through his chest. "They can come to you. I'll send them in shifts so you're not overwhelmed." "That's thoughtful. Thank you." They stood there, an awkward silence settling between them. Garrett knew he should leave. The business was concluded. There was no reason to linger, but his feet seemed rooted to the floor. "Mr. Hale," Clara said gently, "you're allowed to leave now. I've got your order, and I promise I'll do good work." "I know you will." The words came out without thought. "You don't seem like the type to do anything halfway." A genuine smile spread across her face. "No, I suppose I don't. My aunt used to say I approached life like I was trying to conquer it rather than live through it." "Your aunt, the one who left you the shop." "The very same. Aunt Judith was complicated. We weren't close, but she was family, and when she died, she left me this place. I think maybe she knew I needed an escape route." "From what?" The question was too personal, too probing. Garrett knew it the moment it left his mouth, but instead of deflecting or taking offense, Clara considered him with those steady green eyes. "From expectations," she said finally, "from a life that looked perfect on paper but felt like suffocating. From people who loved me but couldn't see me." She paused. "I imagine you understand something about that, about feeling trapped in a life that doesn't fit anymore." Garrett's throat tightened. "I should go." "You should," she agreed, but there was no judgment in her tone. "But for what it's worth, Mr. Hale, running gets exhausting eventually. Trust me. I know." He left without responding, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Outside, he stood on the boardwalk, breathing hard, trying to understand what had just happened. Nothing had happened. He'd ordered hats for his men, that was all. A simple business transaction. Except it wasn't, and they both knew it. Garrett mounted his horse and rode out of town at a pace just short of fleeing, Clara's words echoing in his head. Running gets exhausting eventually. He'd been running for 5 years, running from grief, from memory, from the possibility of ever feeling anything again. And Clara Wynne, with her knowing eyes and matter-of-fact empathy, had seen through it in 2 conversations. It should have made him angry. Instead, it just made him tired. Back at the ranch, Pete was waiting. "How'd it go?" "Ordered 15 hats. They'll be ready in 3 weeks." "That's good. Real good." Pete studied him carefully. "You all right, boss?" "Fine." "You don't look fine. You look like you saw a ghost." Garrett headed for the house. "Just tired, Pete. Long day." But lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Garrett knew the truth. He wasn't tired. He was afraid. Because for the first time in 5 years, something inside him had stirred to life, something he'd thought was buried for good. And Clara Wynne, with her bright laugh and gentle challenges, had made him feel it. The following Monday arrived with an unexpected complication. Garrett was in the barn at dawn, checking on a mare that was due to foal any day, when Tommy came running up with news that made his jaw clench. "Boss, we got a problem. Big storm rolled through last night. Took out the bridge over Miller's Creek. Pete says we can't get the cattle to the north pasture without it, and we got nearly 100 head that need moving today." Garrett swore under his breath. Miller's Creek ran through the eastern edge of his property, and the bridge was the only safe crossing point for livestock. Without it, they'd have to drive the herd 3 miles out of the way, adding hours to what should have been a simple move. "How bad is it?" "Real bad. Whole middle section's gone. Pete thinks it'll take 3, maybe 4 days to rebuild." 4 days they didn't have. The north pasture had fresh grass the cattle needed, and delaying the move would throw off their entire grazing rotation. Garrett made a quick decision. "Get the men together. We're driving them the long way, and send someone into town. We'll need extra lumber and hardware from Henderson's. I want that bridge rebuilt by week's end." "Yes, sir." Tommy hesitated. Boss? About sending someone to town. All the men are going to be tied up with the cattle drive. It's going to take all hands." Which meant Garrett would have to go himself. Of course, because apparently the universe had decided he needed to spend more time in Silver Ridge whether he liked it or not. 2 hours later, hot, dusty, and irritable from helping move the first group of cattle, Garrett rode into town with a list of supplies and a determination to make this as quick as possible. He'd get what he needed, get out, and definitely not think about a certain hat shop or its owner. Henderson's Mercantile was busy. Several townswomen clustered around the fabric section, their voices carrying across the store. Garrett kept his head down, grabbed a basket, and started gathering supplies. Lumber he'd have to order and arrange for delivery. But the hardware, nails, brackets, rope, he could take today. "Simply scandalous, if you ask me," one of the women was saying, her voice pitched to Carrie. Garrett recognized Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife and the town's most dedicated gossip. A woman living alone, running a business. It's not natural. "Now, Margaret," another voice chimed in. Mrs. Henderson, Jim's wife, more diplomatic than Pemberton, but no less interested in other people's affairs. "Miss Wynne is perfectly respectable, and she's doing quite well with that shop." "That's exactly my point. She's doing too well, drawing attention. Did you hear she turned down David Hutchins, the mayor's nephew, a perfectly good match, and she dismissed him like he was nothing?" "Maybe she wasn't interested," a third voice suggested, younger, more tentative. "Women are allowed to refuse proposals, Margaret." "Of course they are, dear. But 3 refusals in as many weeks? It suggests a certain unwillingness to accept her proper place. Mark my words, that kind of independence leads to trouble." Garrett found himself gripping a box of nails hard enough to hurt. He told himself it was none of his business. Clara Wynne could handle herself, she'd made that abundantly clear. But something about hearing her discussed like she was a problem to be solved made his blood simmer. "Excuse me, ladies." Jim Henderson appeared, his timing impeccable. "I need to get to those fabric bolts. Could you shift just a bit?" The women moved, their conversation dissolving into pleasantries with the shop owner. Garrett brought his supplies to the counter, keeping his expression neutral. "That everything, Garrett?" Jim asked, tallying the items. "Need to order lumber. Bridge went out." "Heard about that. Storm was fierce last night. How much you need?" They discussed specifications and delivery times, Jim making notes. The women had moved on to examining buttons, but Garrett could feel their sideways glances. He was probably fuel for gossip too, the hermit rancher, actually coming to town, actually speaking to people. "I'll have it delivered day after tomorrow," Jim said. "That work?" "Fine." Garrett paid and was gathering his purchases when the shop door opened and Clara Wynne walked in. She looked windblown and slightly frazzled, her hair coming loose from its pins, a streak of what looked like ink on her cheek. But her eyes were bright, and when she saw Jim, she smiled with obvious relief. "Mr. Henderson, thank goodness. I need thread. Not the regular cotton, but the heavy-duty kind you use for leather work. I miscalculated how much I'd need for a large commission, and I'm completely out." "Sure thing, Miss Wynne. It's in the back. Give me just a moment." Clara nodded, then noticed Garrett standing by the counter. Her expression shifted, not displeasure exactly, but a certain wariness, like she wasn't sure whether he wanted to be acknowledged or left alone. He should leave, should walk out before this became a conversation, but something stubborn in him refused to run. "Miss Wynne." "Mr. Hale." She moved closer, setting her small purse on the counter. "Didn't expect to see you in town today." "Bridge went out, needed supplies." "Ah, the storm. I heard it was quite severe." She glanced at his purchases. "Looks like you've got your work cut out for you." "It's ranch work, always something." An awkward silence fell between them, made more uncomfortable by the fact that he could feel every woman in the store listening. Their conversation paused, ears practically quivering with interest. Clara seemed to notice it too, because a wry smile touched her lips. "We appear to be today's entertainment," she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. Despite himself, Garrett felt his mouth twitch. "Happens when you're new, or when you're me. The hermit rancher and the scandalous shopkeeper. We should charge admission." The comment was so unexpected, so perfectly dry, that Garrett almost laughed. Actually, laughed. He caught himself, but not before Clara's eyes widened slightly, like she'd seen something surprising. "Here we are, Miss Wynne." Jim returned with several spools of heavy thread. "This should do you." "Perfect. Thank you." She paid quickly, tucked the thread into her bag, and turned to leave, then paused, looking back at Garrett. "Mr. Hale, if you have a moment, I wanted to ask you something about the hat commission. Professional question." It was an excuse. They both knew it. But it gave them a reason to walk out together, to escape the avid stares. Outside, Clara led them a few doors down, out of direct view of the mercantile windows, and stopped. The wind caught her loose hair, and she pushed it back impatiently. "There's no question about the hats, is there?" Garrett asked. "No. But you looked like you wanted to escape, and I've learned that sometimes the best way to deflect gossip is to give them exactly what they expect, but on your own terms." "And they expect us to talk?" "They expect me to chase every eligible man in town, and they expect you to run from anyone who tries to get close. By talking in public, we're both proving them wrong while proving them right. It's actually rather clever." Garrett stared at her. "You think about these things?" "Mr. Hale, I'm a single woman running a business in a small town. I have to think about these things. Reputation is currency here, and I can't afford to let other people spend mine carelessly." She adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "But since I did drag you out here under false pretenses, I suppose I should actually ask you something. How are your men taking to the idea of new hats?" "Haven't told them yet." "Afraid they'll rebel?" There was teasing in her tone, gentle enough not to offend. "They're cowboys. They'll complain about anything new until they realize it's better than what they had." "Sounds like most people." Clara glanced back toward the mercantile, where Mrs. Pemberton's face was visible in the window. "I should go. I've got 3 hats to finish by Friday, and I'm behind schedule." "The commission you mentioned." "Yes. Mrs. Patterson wants them for her daughters. Very specific requirements, very tight deadline. But I've never missed a deadline yet, and I don't intend to start now." That stubborn pride again, the determination that seemed to radiate from her. Garrett found himself asking, "You always this driven?" Clara considered the question seriously. "I suppose I am. My father used to say I attacked life like it owed me something. Maybe it does. Maybe we all deserve more than just surviving." Her green eyes found his. "Don't you think?" The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through Garrett's carefully maintained defenses. Before he could formulate an answer, before he even knew what his answer would be, Clara smiled and stepped back. "Enjoy your bridge repair, Mr. Hale. I'll see you when your men come for their fittings." She walked away, leaving Garrett standing on the boardwalk, feeling like he'd just been in a conversation that mattered far more than it should have. "Garrett Hale, was that you talking to Miss Wynne?" Mrs. Pemberton had emerged from the mercantile, her expression eager with curiosity. "Ma'am." He touched his hat and headed for his horse before she could launch into whatever interrogation she had planned. But as he rode out of town, he couldn't stop turning Clara's words over in his mind. Maybe we all deserve more than just surviving. Did he deserve more? Did he even want more? For 5 years, surviving had been enough. More than enough. It was all he could manage. Yet something about the way Clara had looked at him when she said it made him wonder, if only for a moment, what more might feel like. The cattle drive took the rest of the day and most of his attention, which Garrett welcomed. Physical work, problem solving, managing men and animals, these were things he understood. These didn't require examining uncomfortable feelings or questioning the life he'd built in the ruins of the old one. By the time they got the herd settled in the north pasture, the sun was setting and every muscle in Garrett's body ached. Pete rode up beside him as they headed back to the ranch. "That went smoother than expected," the old foreman said, "though I'd feel better once that bridge is fixed. Lumber's coming day after tomorrow. We'll start repairs immediately." "Good, good." Pete was quiet for a moment, then added casually, "Saw you talking to Miss Wynne in town." Garrett's jaw tightened. "You keeping tabs on me now?" "Not keeping tabs, just observing. You talked to her longer than you've talked to anyone outside this ranch in years." She had a question about the hat order. Uh-huh. Pete's skepticism was palpable. "And that required standing on the street in full view of every gossip in town." "Drop it, Pete. I'm just saying, I know what you're saying, and I'm telling you to drop it." Garrett kicked his horse into a faster pace, leaving Pete behind. But alone in his house that night, nursing a whiskey and staring into the empty fireplace, Garrett couldn't drop it. Couldn't stop thinking about Clara's question, about what he deserved, what he wanted, whether surviving was really enough. Sarah had been gone for 5 years. Their son, taken before he'd barely lived. The grief had nearly destroyed Garrett, would have destroyed him probably, if not for the ranch giving him something to focus on. He'd rebuilt his life around work and whiskey and careful numbness, and it had been enough. It had been enough because he'd made it be enough. Because wanting more, hoping for more, opening himself up to more, that path led to pain, to loss, to the soul-crushing agony of loving something and having it ripped away. Better to feel nothing, safer. But Clara Wynne, with her bright laugh and stubborn pride and penetrating questions, was making nothing harder to maintain. And Garrett didn't know whether to be grateful or furious about it. Over the next several days, Garrett threw himself into bridge repairs with an intensity that worried his men. He worked from dawn until he was too exhausted to think, drove himself until his hands bled, and Pete finally ordered him to take a break. "You're going to collapse," the foreman said bluntly. "Then where will we be?" "Go home, boss. Rest. That's an order." "You don't give me orders." "Today I do. Go home. Eat something. Sleep. Come back tomorrow when you're not half dead." Garrett wanted to argue, but the truth was, he was exhausted. He rode back to the ranch, let Maria fuss over him with food and disapproval, and fell into bed fully clothed. He dreamed of Sarah, which wasn't unusual, but this time the dream was different. She was sitting in her favorite chair, the one by the fireplace, and she was smiling at him with that gentle expression she'd had when he was being stubborn. "You can't hide forever, Garrett," Dream Sarah said. "That's not living. That's just a different kind of dying." "I'm not hiding," he told her. "I'm just being careful." "You're terrified. There's a difference." She stood, crossed to him, and placed her hand over his heart. "This is still working, you know, still beating, still capable of feeling. Don't waste it, love. Don't waste what's left of your life being afraid." He woke with a start, his heart pounding, sweat soaking his shirt. The room was dark except for the moonlight streaming through the window, and for just a moment he could have sworn he smelled Sarah's perfume, lilac and rosewater. But the room was empty. It had been empty for 5 years. Garrett sat up, scrubbed his hands over his face, and tried to shake off the dream. But Sarah's words lingered. "Don't waste what's left of your life being afraid." Was that what he was doing? Wasting his life? The question haunted him through the rest of the week as they finished the bridge repairs. Haunted him when he sent Tommy to town for supplies instead of going himself. Haunted him when 3 of his men came back from their hat fittings talking about how nice Miss Wynne was, how professional, how she'd actually listened to their concerns and adjusted her designs accordingly. "She asked about what we do all day," Rodriguez reported. "Really asked, like she cared. Then she showed me how the hat could have a pocket inside the crown for small tools." "Boss, nobody's ever thought of that before." "She's smart," Murphy added, "knows her business, and she didn't treat us like dumb ranch hands, treated us like her opinion mattered." Even Pete, who'd gone for his fitting despite not being part of the original commission, came back impressed. That woman's got a gift, Garrett. She looked at my old hat for maybe 30 seconds and knew exactly what was wrong with it, made suggestions that'll actually help. You picked a good one for this order. It was Hutchins' idea, Garrett muttered. Maybe. But you went through with it. That's what matters. The hats were delivered 3 weeks later, exactly on schedule. Tommy brought them out to the ranch in a wagon, 15 perfect, practical, beautifully crafted hats, each one customized based on the individual fittings. The men tried them on with typical cowboy skepticism that quickly dissolved into genuine approval. "This is actually comfortable," Rodriguez said, adjusting his. "And look, it's got my initials inside the band." She put everyone's initials. The personal touch surprised Garrett more than it should have. It was the kind of detail that showed Clara took pride in her work, that she saw these hats as more than just a transaction. Each one was a piece of craftsmanship meant for a specific person. "Boss, you gotta see this." Tommy was examining his hat with something like wonder. "She reinforced the side where I always grab it. How'd she know I do that?" "She asked," Murphy said. "That's how. She asked what we needed, and then she actually listened. Revolutionary concept." The men laughed, and Garrett found himself holding one of the hats, the one Clara had made for Pete, with extra ventilation because the old man complained about his head getting too hot. She'd thought of everything. "Someone needs to take her the final payment," Pete said, looking pointedly at Garrett, "and maybe thank her for the excellent work. Tommy can do it." "Tommy's got fence duty. Rodriguez and Murphy are moving cattle. Jacobs is shoeing horses. And I'm too old to ride to town just to deliver money." Pete's expression was innocent. "Looks like it's gotta be you, boss." Garrett knew when he was being maneuvered. "Fine. I'll go tomorrow." "Why not today? Sun's still up. You could be back before dark." Because going today meant less time to prepare himself, less time to build up his defenses. But Pete was right. It did make more sense to go now, get it over with. "Fine," Garrett said again, and went to get the payment from his office safe. The ride into town felt longer than usual. His nerves pulled taut with something between anticipation and dread. He told himself it was just a business transaction. Pay for services rendered, express appreciation for quality work, leave. Simple, professional, nothing complicated about it. But when he walked into the hat shop and saw Clara bent over her workbench with that streak of concentration between her brows, something in his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with business. She looked up, and her face lit with a smile that made him forget every defense he'd carefully constructed on the ride over. "Mr. Hale. Perfect timing. I was just thinking about you." Those 5 words shouldn't have affected him, but they did. "The hats arrived," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "The men are pleased." "Oh, good. I'm so glad. I was worried I might have miscalculated on a few of the measurements, but if they're happy, then I'm happy." She set down her scissors and stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "Did the special features work out? The tool pockets? The reinforced brims?" "Worked perfectly. You did excellent work, Miss Wynne. Better than expected." High praise from a man who doesn't seem inclined to give praise lightly. She smiled, clearly pleased. "Thank you." Garrett pulled out the payment, the remaining balance plus a little extra. "Consider the additional my thanks for the personal touches. The initials, the customization. You went beyond what was required." Clara took the money, counted it, then looked at him with raised eyebrows. "This is too much. It's what the work deserves." "Mr. Hale, I quote my prices fairly. I don't need charity." "It's not charity. It's recognition of quality." He held her gaze steadily. "You earned it." For a moment, Clara looked like she might argue further. Then she nodded, tucking the money away. "Thank you. That's generous of you." They stood there in awkward silence. The business concluded, no reason for him to stay. Garrett should have left, should have tipped his hat, walked out, and returned to his safe, solitary existence. Instead, he heard himself ask, "You ever take breaks?" Clara blinked, surprised. "I'm sorry?" "Breaks. You're always working when I see you. You ever stop?" "Sometimes. When I remember to." She tilted her head, curiosity evident. "Why?" "Because I want to talk to you. Because something about you makes me feel less dead inside. Because I'm terrified and intrigued in equal measure, and I don't know what to do with that." "Just wondering," he said instead. "Seems like you push yourself hard." I do, but so do you, from what I hear. Clara leaned against her workbench, studying him with those too perceptive green eyes. We're alike that way, I think. Using work to avoid other things. I'm not avoiding anything. Of course not. Neither am I. The gentle irony in her tone made it clear she knew they were both lying. But hypothetically, if we were avoiding things, at least we're productive about it. Despite himself, Garrett felt that strange pull toward her again, that sense of being understood without having to explain. It was unsettling, appealing, dangerous. I should go, he said abruptly. You should, Clara agreed. But she didn't move, and neither did he. The moment stretched between them, loaded with unspoken things. Then the shop door opened, breaking the spell. A woman Garrett vaguely recognized, the school teacher's sister, bustled in, talking before she'd fully entered. Miss Wynne, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I desperately need your help with… Oh, Mr. Hale, I didn't realize you were here. Just leaving, Garrett said, grateful for the interruption, even as part of him resented it. He touched his hat to Clara. Miss Wynne, thank you again for the excellent work. You're very welcome, Mr. Hale. If your men need any adjustments, just send them by. He left, but not before catching the speculative look on the schoolteacher's sister's face. Great. More gossip. More speculation about the hermit rancher and the newcomer. Let them talk. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. Except as Garrett rode home through the lengthening shadows, he couldn't stop replaying the conversation. The way Clara had looked at him. The moment when they'd both stood there, neither wanting to leave, both too careful to acknowledge why. Maria was waiting when he got back, a knowing expression on her weathered face that made him immediately suspicious. What? Nothing, Jefe. Just nice to see you going to town more often. It was business. Of course. Business. She turned back to her cooking, but he could see the smile she was trying to hide. Though maybe business that makes you remember you're still alive is not such a bad thing. Garrett didn't dignify that with a response. He poured himself a whiskey, took it out to the porch, and stood in his usual spot watching the sun set over his land, his ranch, his domain, his carefully constructed sanctuary from feeling too much. But even here, supposedly safe, he could still see Clara's smile, still hear her voice, still feel that dangerous pull toward something he'd sworn never to risk again. Damn it, he muttered into his glass. The whiskey had no answers. It never did. But it helped blur the edges of the question. What if Sarah was right? What if hiding was just another kind of dying? And what if Clara Wynne, with her stubborn pride and penetrating insight and that laugh that made him remember what joy sounded like, what if she was showing him a path back to living? Garrett drained his glass and went inside before he could chase that thought any further. Some questions were too dangerous to answer. Some paths led places you could never come back from. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't escape the truth. Whether he wanted to or not, whether he was ready or not, Clara Wynne had already started breaking through his defenses. And he didn't know if that terrified him or gave him hope. The hope, it turned out, was more persistent than the terror. Over the following weeks, Garrett found himself thinking about Clara at the most inconvenient times. While checking fence lines, he'd remember something she'd said. While reviewing the ranch books, he'd wonder what she was working on. And every time he had legitimate business in town, which seemed to be happening with suspicious frequency, his route somehow took him past her shop. He never stopped, just rode by, caught glimpses of her through the window. It was pathetic, he knew. A grown man acting like a schoolboy with his first crush. But he couldn't seem to help himself, and that lack of control bothered him almost as much as the feelings themselves. It was Pete who finally forced his hand, though the old foreman probably didn't realize he was doing it. Got a problem, boss, Pete said one morning in early June. Mrs. Patterson commissioned those hats from Miss Wynne for her daughters, remember? Well, apparently her youngest loved hers so much that Mrs. Patterson wants to order riding outfits to match. Asked if Miss Wynne does clothing work too. Garrett looked up from the bridle he was mending. And Miss Wynne said she does, but she'd need input from someone who actually knows ranching. She wants to make sure the outfits are practical, not just pretty. Mrs. Patterson suggested you. Me? Why me? Pete gave him a look that said the answer should be obvious. Because you're particular about quality, you know what works in the field, and according to Mrs. Patterson, Miss Wynne specifically mentioned she'd value your opinion after seeing how well the Hat Commission turned out. She'd mentioned him, specifically, asked for his input. The knowledge sent an unwelcome flutter through Garrett's chest. She can ask someone else. There is no one else, not really. The other ranchers either don't care enough about the details, or they'd try to court her the whole time. You're the only one who'll actually focus on the work. Pete paused. Unless you got some other reason for refusing. The challenge in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Garrett scowled. Fine. When does she need this input? Soon as possible. Mrs. Patterson wants the outfits done by the end of summer for some fancy party she's planning, which meant Garrett would have to go to town, meet with Clara, and somehow maintain his carefully constructed emotional distance while discussing fabric and stitching. Perfect. Just perfect. He rode into Silver Ridge 2 days later, having put it off as long as he could justify. The town was busy with mid-morning commerce, wagons rolling past, shopkeepers sweeping their walkways, children dodging between adults on their way to the schoolhouse. Garrett tied his horse outside Clara's shop and stood for a moment, gathering himself. It's just business. Professional consultation. Nothing more. The bell chimed as he entered. Clara was with a customer, an older woman Garrett didn't recognize, discussing trim options for a bonnet. She glanced up, and her face brightened when she saw him. Mr. Hale, wonderful. I'll be with you in just a moment. He nodded and moved to the side, pretending to examine the hat displays while actually watching Clara work. She had a way of making people feel heard, leaning in when they spoke, asking clarifying questions, offering suggestions without being pushy. The customer left satisfied, clutching a hat box, and Clara turned to Garrett with a smile that made his pulse quicken. Thank you for coming. I know this probably seems like an odd request. Mrs. Patterson explained the situation. Did she explain that I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing? Clara laughed, gesturing to a collection of sketches spread across her workbench. I can make a beautiful writing outfit, certainly. But beautiful and practical aren't always the same thing, and I don't want to send Mrs. Patterson's daughters out in something that'll fall apart the first time they actually ride. Garrett moved to the workbench, studying the sketches. They were good, elegant designs that showed Clara's artistic eye. But she was right to be concerned. Several elements would be disasters in actual use. This fabric, he said, pointing to one sketch. Too delicate. It'll snag on every branch and tear in a week. I thought so, but I wasn't sure. What about this? She indicated another design. Better, but these buttons are decorative. You need something more secure. He reached for a pencil without thinking. May I? Please? They bent over the sketches together, Garrett marking changes, Clara asking questions and making notes. She was a quick study, grasping concepts immediately and pushing back when she thought he was being too conservative. What about split skirts instead of traditional riding skirts? She asked. I've seen illustrations in fashion magazines from New York. They allow more freedom of movement. They're practical but scandalous by Silver Ridge standards. Mrs. Patterson might not approve. Then we make them with a button panel that can convert them to look traditional when not in use. Best of both worlds. Garrett looked at her, impressed despite himself. That's clever. I have my moments. Clara's eyes sparkled. Though I'm learning that true practicality requires someone who actually lives the life. This is invaluable, Mr. Hale. Thank you. They continued working, falling into an easy rhythm. Clara would suggest, Garrett would evaluate. They'd compromise on solutions. At some point, she made tea without asking if he wanted any, just pressed a cup into his hands and returned to the sketches. It was comfortable in a way that shouldn't have been possible between two people who barely knew each other. What about pockets? Claire asked suddenly. I always think women's clothing should have more pockets, but I'm never sure where to put them without ruining the line of the garment. Here, Garrett indicated a spot on the hip. And here, inside the jacket. Big enough for useful items, gloves, small tools, whatever they might need. You're good at this. Have you designed clothing before? The question caught him off guard. For a moment he was back in his mother's sewing room watching her work, learning alongside Sarah as his wife developed her own skills. Sarah had been talented with a needle, had made most of their curtains, had been sewing baby clothes when the fever took her. My mother was a seamstress, he said, his voice careful. Before she married my father, and my wife. He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Clara looked up, her expression gentle but not pitying. Your wife sewed? Yes, she was skilled. I learned some from watching her, and from helping when she needed an opinion on whether something was practical. It was the most he'd spoken about Sarah to anyone outside his immediate circle in years. The words should have hurt, should have felt like betrayal. Instead, they felt like relief, like finally letting out a breath he'd been holding too long. She sounds like she was talented, Clara said softly, and patient to teach you. She was both. Garrett set down his pencil, suddenly needing distance. I should go. You have enough to work with now. Mr. Hale. Garrett, wait. Clara reached out, her hand hovering near his arm, but not quite touching. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You didn't upset me. Then why are you running? The directness of the question stopped him cold. He turned, finding her watching him with those too perceptive eyes. I'm not running. You are. You do it every time something gets too real, too close. You retreat behind your walls. Claire's voice was gentle but firm. I'm not trying to force anything, and I'm not trying to replace anyone. I just thought maybe we could be friends, people who talk honestly without all the careful dancing around. Friends. The word should have been safe, simple. But the way she said it, the way she was looking at him, suggested it meant something more, something that terrified and tempted him in equal measure. I'm not good at friends, he said roughly. Neither am I, as it happens. But maybe that's why we should try. She smiled, and it was the saddest smile he'd ever seen. I lost someone too, you know. Not a spouse, my fiancée. 3 years ago, just before our wedding. Carriage accident. One moment I had a future, the next I had nothing but sympathy cards and a wedding dress I'd never wear. Garrett's breath caught. Clara, I know what it's like is what I'm saying. To have your life carved into before and after, to feel like you're supposed to move on but you don't know how, to be so afraid of caring again that you'd rather feel nothing. She met his eyes squarely. But nothing isn't living, Garrett. It's just existing, and we both deserve better than that. There it was again, that insistence that they deserved more, that surviving wasn't enough. Clara believed it with a fierce certainty that made Garrett want to believe it too, even as everything in him resisted. I don't know if I can, he admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep. I don't know if I have anything left to give. You don't have to give anything, you just have to be willing to receive. Clara did touch him then, just a light pressure on his forearm. Stay. Have tea. Talk to me like I'm a person, not a threat. Can you do that? Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to protect himself, to retreat to the safety of his ranch and his whiskey and his carefully maintained numbness. But something stronger, something that had been growing since the first moment he saw her, made him nod. I can try. Relief flooded Clara's face. Good. That's all I ask. Now sit down before you fall down. You look like you've been worked half to death. She was right. He was exhausted. The combination of physical labor and emotional turmoil had worn him thin. Garrett sank into the chair she indicated, accepted another cup of tea, and watched as Clara bustled around her shop, tidying up, humming softly to herself. Tell me about your ranch, she said after a moment. Not the business of it, but what it's like, what you love about it. What I love? Yes, there must be something, or you wouldn't work yourself to exhaustion running it. Garrett considered the question. What did he love about the ranch? It had been so long since he'd thought of it in terms of love rather than duty. The mornings, he said finally, right at dawn, when the world's quiet and the mountains catch the first light. Everything's still, peaceful, like the land's taking a breath before the day begins. Clara smiled, settling into her own chair. That sounds beautiful. It is, or it was. I haven't noticed much in a while. Maybe you'll start noticing again. She sipped her tea. What else? The horses. I've got a mare, Starlight. She's temperamental as hell, but smart. Knows what you're thinking before you think it. Sarah used to ride her. The name slipped out naturally, and this time it didn't hurt quite as much. Clara didn't flinch, didn't offer platitudes, just nodded like he'd said something perfectly normal. Sounds like Starlight was special to both of you. She was, is, offer platitudes, just nodded like he'd said something perfectly normal. Sounds like Starlight was special to both of you. She was, is. Garrett found himself continuing, words flowing easier than they had in years. The ranch was my father's dream, but it became mine too. Building something lasting, something that matters. Making the land productive, keeping the cattle healthy, providing work for good men. It's purpose, I guess. Purpose is important, Clara agreed. It's what keeps us moving forward when everything else falls apart. They talked for an hour, maybe more. Clara told him about Boston, about growing up in her father's shipping business, about learning to navigate a world that didn't particularly want women to have opinions or ambitions. She told him about her fiancé, a good man, she said, but perhaps not the right man. And maybe she'd been more in love with the idea of marriage than the reality of it. Does that sound terrible? She asked. To say I wasn't sure I wanted to marry him, even before he died? Sounds honest. Honest isn't always kind. I felt guilty for years, wondering if somehow my doubts caused... She shook her head. Ridiculous, I know, but grief makes us think ridiculous things. It does, Garrett agreed quietly. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Understanding, recognition, the knowledge that they'd both walked through similar darkness and somehow found their way back to light. The shop door opened, breaking the moment. A young woman entered, looking harried, and Clara stood to greet her. Garrett took the opportunity to slip out, murmuring a goodbye that Clara acknowledged with a knowing smile. Outside, the sun was high and bright, making him squint. Garrett untied his horse, his mind churning. That conversation, that simple, honest conversation, had cracked something open inside him, something he'd thought was sealed permanently. He rode back to the ranch in a daze, Clara's words echoing in his head. Nothing isn't living, it's just existing, and we both deserve better than that. Did he deserve better? More importantly, was he brave enough to reach for it? The question haunted him through the rest of June. He tried to focus on work. There was always work, but found his concentration slipping at odd moments. Pete caught him staring into space more than once, his expression knowing but mercifully silent. Maria began humming wedding songs while she cooked, which Garrett steadfastly ignored even as his ears burned. When the invitation arrived, delivered by a breathless Tommy who'd picked it up in town, Garrett knew his period of avoidance was over. It's from Mrs. Patterson, Tommy explained unnecessarily, since the expensive stationery and formal script made that obvious. Some kind of party. She's inviting the whole town, apparently. Says it's to show off her daughter's new riding outfits. Garrett opened the invitation, scanning the flowery prose. A summer social, outdoors at the Patterson estate, with dinner and dancing and all the trappings of civilized society that Garrett normally avoided like the plague. The date was 3 weeks away, and attendance was expected from all prominent citizens of Silver Ridge. You going, boss? Tommy asked eagerly. The kid loved any excuse for a party. No. But it says, I know what it says, still not going. Except 3 days later, Clara appeared at his ranch. Garrett was in the corral working with a young stallion, breaking him to saddle, a process that required patience and persistence, when Pete came to get him. Boss, you got a visitor. Tell them I'm busy. You're going to want to take this one, trust me. Something in Pete's tone made Garrett look up. The old foreman was grinning like he'd just won a bet with himself. Swearing under his breath, Garrett handed off the stallion to Rodriguez and headed toward the house. Clara stood on his porch, looking windblown and slightly out of place in her city clothes, but no less striking for it. She held a leather portfolio under one arm and wore an expression that was half determination, half nervousness. Miss Wynne. Garrett's voice came out rougher than intended, surprise and something else making it catch. What are you doing here? I need your help, she said directly. May I come in? Every instinct told him this was a bad idea. Clara at his ranch, in the space he'd shared with Sarah, surrounded by memories. It felt like worlds colliding in ways he wasn't ready for. But she'd come all this way, and refusing would be not just rude but cowardly. Of course. He led her inside, acutely aware of how intimate it felt to have her in his home. Maria appeared from the kitchen, took one look at Clara, and smiled broadly. "Miss Wynne, what a lovely surprise. I'm Maria, the housekeeper. Can I get you anything? Tea? Water?" "Water would be wonderful, thank you. It's a warm day for riding." "You rode here?" Garrett asked, surprised. "Rented a horse from the livery. Mr. Henderson was kind enough to give me directions." Clara set her portfolio on the table. "I'm sorry to intrude, but this couldn't wait. Mrs. Patterson has moved up her timeline. She wants the outfits finished in 2 weeks instead of 6. I'm going to need more help with the practical elements, and I need it now." It was a reasonable explanation, a legitimate business reason for her presence. But Garrett caught the slight tremor in her hands as she opened the portfolio, the way she didn't quite meet his eyes. She was nervous. Why? Maria brought water, lingered long enough to give Garrett a meaningful look, and disappeared back to the kitchen. Clara drank deeply, then spread out her revised sketches. "I've incorporated your suggestions, but I need you to look at the construction. I'm worried about the stress points, where the fabric might tear or the seams might fail under actual use." They bent over the sketches together, just as they had in her shop. But the atmosphere felt different here. More charged, more intimate. Garrett forced himself to focus on the drawings, pointing out potential problems, suggesting solutions. "This stitching needs to be reinforced, double-seamed at minimum." "Like this?" Clara sketched quickly, her shoulder brushing his. "Yes, exactly, and here, you'll want gussets for better movement." They worked for an hour, the conversation flowing between professional and personal. Clara asked about his mother's techniques. Garrett found himself telling stories he hadn't shared in years, about learning to sew as a boy, about his father's initial disapproval, followed by grudging respect when he realized Garrett had inherited his mother's eye for detail. "My father believed men should only know men's work," Garrett said. "Took him years to understand that knowledge is knowledge, regardless of who typically does it." "Sounds like my father," Clara murmured. "He couldn't understand why I wanted to work at all when I could have married well and been taken care of." She said the last words with bitter irony, as if being taken care of is the same as living your own life. "Is that why you came west? To escape that?" "Partly, but also because I wanted to prove I could, that I was capable of building something myself, not just being an ornament in someone else's life." She looked at him directly. "Does that sound selfish?" "Sounds brave." Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, then warmth, then something deeper that made Garrett's heart stutter. The air between them felt thick, charged with unspoken things. "Garrett," she said softly, and just his name and her voice undid something inside him. "You should go," he said abruptly, stepping back. "I've given you what you need. You can handle the rest yourself." "Should I go, or do you want me to go? Because those are different things." The directness again, cutting through his defenses like they were made of paper. Garrett turned away, gripping the edge of the table. "What do you want from me, Clara?" "I want you to come to Mrs. Patterson's party." Of all the things she could have said, that was the most unexpected. Garrett turned back, staring at her. "What?" "The party, in 2 weeks. I know you received an invitation. I know you're planning to refuse, but I'm asking you to come anyway." Clara's hands twisted together, betraying her nervousness. I'd like someone there who sees me as more than just the novelty newcomer. Someone I can talk to honestly. A friend." That word again. Friend. It should have been simple. It wasn't. "I don't do parties." "I know, but maybe you could try? Just this once?" She paused. "I'm terrified, if I'm being honest. All those people, all that scrutiny. I'll be displaying my work. And what if they hate it? What if I've failed? I'd feel braver if you were there." The admission cost her. He could see it. Clara Wynne, so confident and capable, confessing to fear, asking for help, asking for him specifically. Garrett wanted to refuse, wanted to protect himself, maintain his distance, keep his carefully rebuilt walls intact. But looking at her, at the vulnerability in her eyes, the hope she was trying to hide, he found himself incapable of saying no. "I'll think about it." Clara's face fell slightly, but she nodded. That's fair. Thank you for considering it. She gathered her sketches, tucking them back into the portfolio. And thank you for your help today. I'll make sure Mrs. Patterson knows how invaluable your input has been. Clara. The name came out before he could stop it, intimate and familiar. She looked up, hope rekindling in her expression. If I come to this party, it's because you asked, not because of Mrs. Patterson or social obligation or anything else. You understand that? I understand. Her smile was small but genuine. That's all I need. Maria appeared to show Clara out, but not before giving Garrett a look that clearly said, if you let this woman walk away, you're a fool. He wanted to argue that he wasn't letting her walk away. She was just leaving after a business meeting. But the truth was more complicated, and they both knew it. Through the window, he watched Clara mount her rented horse and ride away, her posture straight and confident despite the emotional vulnerability she'd just displayed. She was remarkable, Garrett realized, strong and scared, confident and uncertain, all at once. Real in a way that cut through pretense and demanded honesty in return. She's good for you, Maria said from behind him. Don't start. I'm not starting anything, just observing. You smiled 3 times while she was here. 3 times, Garrett. I haven't seen you smile 3 times in the last 3 years. It was about the sketches. If you say so. Maria's tone made it clear she didn't believe him for a second. But that woman didn't ride all the way out here just for help with sewing. She came because she wanted to see you, because she's brave enough to reach for what she wants, even if it scares her. She paused at the kitchen door. Question is, are you brave enough to reach back? The question stayed with Garrett through dinner, through evening chores, through another restless night. Was he brave enough? Did he even want to be? Yes, something inside him whispered. Yes, you do. The next 2 weeks were a study in internal conflict. Garrett threw himself into ranch work, trying to exhaust his thoughts into submission. But every night, lying in bed, he found himself thinking about Clara, about her laugh, about the way she challenged him, about how she'd confessed her fear and asked for his presence anyway. She was brave enough to risk rejection, to ask for what she needed, to build a new life in an unfamiliar place. And what was he? A coward hiding behind grief, using his loss as an excuse to never risk feeling anything again. Sarah wouldn't have wanted that. His wife, his strong, fierce, loving wife, would have been appalled at what he'd become. She'd have told him to stop wallowing, to honor her memory by living, not by building a shrine to suffering. The realization hit him like a physical blow one night, 6 days before the party. He was standing on his porch, whiskey in hand, staring at the stars, when he finally admitted the truth. He was terrified not of forgetting Sarah, but of remembering what happiness felt like. Because if he remembered, if he allowed himself to feel again, he'd have to acknowledge how much he'd lost. How much he was still losing by choosing numbness over life. And Clara, brave, stubborn, remarkable Clara, was offering him a way back. Not to who he was before, but to who he could still become. 3 days before the party, Garrett rode into town. His hands were sweating inside his work gloves, and his heart hammered against his ribs. This was ridiculous. He was a grown man, a successful rancher, not some lovesick fool, but his hands shook slightly as he tied his horse outside Clara's shop. She was helping a customer when he entered, Mrs. Henderson, examining a display of summer bonnets. Clara glanced up, and her eyes widened when she saw him. She finished with Mrs. Henderson quickly, then turned to Garrett with an expression caught between hope and apprehension. "Mr. Hale." "I'll go," he said without preamble. "To the party." "I'll be there." Clara's face transformed, joy lighting it from within. "Really?" "Really, but I'm not dancing. You don't have to dance. And I'm leaving early if it gets to be too much." "That's fair. And this doesn't mean I'm not promising." He struggled for words, trying to define boundaries he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. "Garrett." Clara stepped closer, her voice gentle. "It's just a party, with a friend, that's all. No expectations beyond that." But they both knew it was more. The way she looked at him, the way his heart raced when she was near, it was already more than friendship, whether they acknowledged it or not. "All right then," he said roughly. "I'll be there." "Thank you." Clara's smile was radiant. "This means more than you know." Garrett left quickly before he could say something foolish or change his mind. But as he rode home, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 long years. Anticipation. Not dread, not numbness, but actual anticipation for a future moment. It was terrifying, it was exhilarating, and it was, perhaps, the first real step toward healing he'd taken since the day he buried his family on that hillside. 3 days, he thought. 3 days? 3 days until everything changed. He just hoped he was ready for it. He wasn't ready. Not even close. The morning of Mrs. Patterson's party dawned bright and merciless, sunlight streaming through Garrett's bedroom window like an accusation. He'd barely slept, his mind churning through every possible disaster scenario. What would he say to people? How would he handle the inevitable questions about his presence? What if seeing Clara in a social setting, surrounded by other men who weren't damaged goods, made him realize how foolish this whole thing was? Maria found him standing in front of his wardrobe, staring at his clothes like they were written in a foreign language. "You need the dark gray suit," she said decisively, pushing past him to retrieve it. "It's formal enough for the occasion, but not so fancy you'll feel like a dressed-up bear." "I feel like a dressed-up bear regardless of what I wear." "Then you'll be a well-dressed bear." She thrust the suit into his arms. "And you'll shave properly, not that half-hearted scraping you usually do. And you'll wear the good boots, the ones without the mud caked on them." Garrett wanted to argue, to find some excuse to back out. But he'd given Clara his word, and despite everything, he was still a man who honored his commitments, even when those commitments terrified him. Pete appeared at the door as Maria bustled out, his weathered face creased with amusement. "Heard you're actually going to the Patterson social." Word travels fast. Tommy told Rodriguez, who told Murphy, who told everyone else. The whole ranch is placing bets on whether you'll actually show up or bolt halfway there. "Glad my life provides entertainment for the men." "They're rooting for you, boss." "We all are." Pete's expression turned serious. "Miss Wynn's a good woman. You deserve some happiness after all you've been through." The assumption that this was about happiness, about romance, about anything beyond simply showing up for someone who'd asked, it made Garrett's collar feel too tight. But he nodded, not trusting himself to speak. 2 hours later, cleaned up and dressed in clothes that felt foreign after years of workwear, Garrett stood on his porch and considered his options. He could still back out, send a note claiming illness or emergency ranch business. Clara would understand, wouldn't she? She'd said no expectations, no pressure. But the image of her face when he'd promised to come, the hope, the relief, the trust, that stopped him cold. She'd been brave enough to ask. He needed to be brave enough to follow through. The ride to the Patterson estate took 45 minutes that felt like 4 hours. The property was impressive even by Silver Ridge standards, a sprawling house with manicured grounds, currently decorated with lanterns and streamers for the party. Carriages and horses lined the drive, and Garrett could hear music and laughter drifting from the back lawn. He almost turned around 3 times before actually dismounting. The party was in full swing when he arrived, dozens of people clustered in small groups across the grounds. Tables laden with food lined one side of the lawn. A small band played under a canvas awning, and everywhere were people who would stare, whisper, wonder what the hermit rancher was doing at a social gathering. Garrett's hands clenched at his sides. This was a mistake, a terrible, horrible mistake. "Garrett Hale, as I live and breathe!" Mayor Hutchins appeared, jovial and slightly drunk. "Didn't think we'd see you here. Wonderful surprise. Come, let me introduce you around." Before Garrett could protest, he was being dragged into the crowd, shaking hands with people whose names he immediately forgot, fielding questions about the ranch that he answered on autopilot. His eyes scanned constantly, looking for Clara, needing an anchor in this sea of social chaos. He finally spotted her near the house, standing with Mrs. Patterson and her daughters. All 3 young women wore the riding outfits Clara had designed, and even from a distance, Garrett could see they were spectacular. Elegant, yet practical, exactly what he and Clara had worked toward. The craftsmanship was impeccable, but it was Clara herself who captured his attention. She wore a dress he'd never seen, deep green silk that brought out her eyes, the cut simple but sophisticated. Her hair was styled in a way that looked effortless but probably wasn't, and when she laughed at something one of the Patterson daughters said, the sound cut through every other noise. She was beautiful. Not in a way that made him forget Sarah, nothing could do that, but in a way that made him remember what it felt like to notice beauty at all. As if sensing his stare, Clara looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded lawn, and her whole face brightened. She excused herself from the Pattersons and began making her way toward him, and Garrett felt his heart rate kick up for reasons that had nothing to do with social anxiety. "You came," she said when she reached him, slightly breathless. "I was starting to think, but you came." "Said I would." "I know, but saying and actually doing are different things, especially for something like this." She glanced around at the crowd, then back at him. "How are you holding up?" Terrified. The honesty surprised them both. Claire's expression softened. "Me too, but we're terrified together, so that's something." "Your outfits look incredible," Garrett said, grateful for a safe topic. The Patterson daughters seemed pleased. "They're thrilled, and I owe it all to your input. The design works perfectly, practical without sacrificing style. Mrs. Patterson's already talking about commissioning more pieces." Pride colored Claire's voice, earned and justified. "Thank you for your help. I couldn't have done this without you." "You could have. You're talented enough to figure it out." "Maybe. But it would have taken longer and involved more mistakes. You saved me time and credibility." She paused, then added quietly, "And you gave me a reason to keep bothering you until you agreed to come tonight." Before Garrett could process that admission, Mrs. Patterson descended upon them, effusive with praise for Clara's work and delight at Garrett's presence. She dragged them both toward a group of prospective clients, and for the next hour, Garrett found himself playing an unexpected role: advocate for Clara's business. He didn't plan it, but when someone expressed doubt about whether a woman could design truly practical work clothes, he found himself describing Clara's attention to detail. When another questioned her prices, he pointed out the quality that justified the cost. And when Mayor Hutchins' nephew, the same one Clara had turned down, made a snide comment about women playing at business, Garrett's response was cold enough to freeze whiskey. "Miss Wynn runs a legitimate, successful enterprise. She's skilled, professional, and provides value to this community. Anyone who can't see that is either blind or stupid. Which are you?" The nephew backed down quickly. Clara, standing beside Garrett, looked up at him with such warmth that his chest tightened. "My fierce defender," she murmured when they were alone again. "He was being an ass." "He was, and you put him in his place beautifully." She touched his arm lightly. "Thank you, again. I seem to keep thanking you." "You don't need to thank me for basic decency." "In my experience, basic decency is rarer than you'd think." Clara's smile was wry. "Come on, let's get away from the crowd for a minute. I'm starting to feel like a curiosity on display." She led him toward the edge of the property, where trees provided shade and relative privacy. Garrett followed, grateful to escape the press of people, the constant scrutiny. Here, with just Clara and the dappled sunlight and the distant sound of music, he could breathe. "Better?" she asked. "Much." He leaned against a tree, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. "How do you do this? Manage all these people, all this social performance?" "Practice and desperation." Clara settled on a nearby bench. "I learned young that perception matters. If people think you're confident, they treat you like you are, even if you're screaming inside." "Are you screaming inside now?" "A little, but less than usual." She looked at him directly. "Having you here helps. I wasn't lying about that. You ground me somehow." The confession hung between them, weighted with meaning. Garrett knew he should deflect, make light of it, maintain the careful distance he'd been trying to preserve. But looking at Clara, at the vulnerability in her eyes, the honesty she offered so freely, he found himself incapable of dishonesty in return. "You ground me too," he admitted roughly. "I don't know how or why, but you do." Clara's breath caught. "Garrett! Mr. Hale! Miss Wynn!" Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "There you are. We're about to start the dancing, and I insist you both participate. Mr. Hale, surely you'll honor Miss Wynn with the first dance." Panic flared in Garrett's chest. Dancing. He'd told Clara he wouldn't dance, and he'd meant it. Dancing was intimate, public, a declaration of interest that everyone would notice and dissect. "Mrs. Patterson, I don't," he started. "I'm afraid I monopolized Mr. Hale's time with business talk," Clara interjected smoothly. "He was kind enough to humor my questions about ranching, but I've stolen enough of his evening. Perhaps another time." She was giving him an out, protecting him from the social obligation. But something in Garrett rebelled against the rescue. Something that had been dormant for 5 years suddenly stirred to life, stubborn and reckless. "Actually," he heard himself say, "I'd be honored to dance with Miss Wynne, if she'll have me." Clara's eyes widened. "You don't have to." "I know." He extended his hand, surprised by his own steadiness. "But I want to, if you're willing to risk your toes." For a moment, Clara just stared at him. Then a slow smile spread across her face, radiant and disbelieving. "I'm willing to risk it." Mrs. Patterson beamed, leading them back toward the lawn where other couples were gathering. The band struck up a waltz. Of course it was a waltz, nothing simple. And Garrett felt his resolve waver. He hadn't danced since Sarah, hadn't held a woman in his arms, hadn't moved to music, hadn't allowed himself that kind of joy. But Clara was waiting, her hand still in his, trust written across her features. And somehow, that made it possible. He pulled her into position, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers, and felt the shock of contact all the way through his body. She was warm and real and present, and when she looked up at him, her green eyes held something that made his heart stutter. "I don't actually know if I remember how," he confessed. "Then we'll figure it out together." The music swelled, and they began to move. Garrett stumbled on the second step, found his rhythm on the third, and by the fourth, it was almost natural. His body remembered what his mind had tried to forget, the pattern of the dance, the give and take, the way two people could move as one. Clara followed his lead effortlessly, her movements graceful and assured. She didn't chatter or try to fill the silence with meaningless talk, just danced with him, her gaze holding his, her presence somehow making the rest of the world fade away. "You're better at this than you claimed," she said after a moment. "Muscle memory. My mother insisted I learn, said a man who couldn't dance was only half civilized." "Your mother was a wise woman." "She was." The words came easier now, the old grief less sharp in Clara's presence. "She'd have liked you." "You think so?" "I know so. She valued strength and independence. You have both in spades." Clara's expression softened. "That might be the nicest compliment anyone's ever given me." They fell silent again, spinning slowly across the lawn. Garrett was acutely aware of every point of contact, his hand at her waist, her hand in his, the whisper of her skirt against his legs. It should have felt wrong, disloyal, a betrayal of everything he'd lost. But it didn't. It felt like waking up after a long, cold sleep.
"Garrett," Clara said softly, "can I tell you something?" "Always." "I'm terrified of this, of what I'm feeling, of what might happen or might not happen. But I'm also glad. Glad I met you. Glad I took the chance. Even if nothing comes of it, I'm glad." Her honesty gutted him, made him want to match it with his own, to lay himself bare the way she did so easily, but the words stuck in his throat, too big and too frightening to release. "I'm glad too," he managed finally. "More than you know." It wasn't everything he wanted to say, but it was truth, and Clara seemed to understand. She smiled, squeezed his hand gently, and they continued dancing as the sun sank lower in the sky and the lanterns began to glow. The song ended too soon. Other couples surrounded them, clapping politely, and Garrett realized they'd been watched the entire time. The whole town had just witnessed the hermit rancher dancing with the newcomer, and by tomorrow, speculation would be rampant. He should have cared, should have worried about gossip and reputation and what people would say. But looking at Clara, at the joy still lingering in her expression, he found he didn't give a damn what anyone thought. "Thank you," she said as they moved off the dance floor. Thank you. We should probably expect questions now." "Let them question." Clara's chin lifted, defiant. "I'm tired of living my life based on what other people expect or approve of. Aren't you?" Yes, God, yes. Garrett was exhausted by it, by the weight of other people's pity, their expectations, their careful handling of him like he was made of glass. Clara saw him as a man, flawed and grieving but still whole, and in her eyes, he felt like he could be that man again. "Miss Wynne, that was lovely," Mrs. Henderson appeared, her expression bright with curiosity. "And Mr. Hale, what a surprise! I had no idea you were such an accomplished dancer." "I'm not," Garrett said shortly.
I just stumbled through well enough not to embarrass my partner.
"Oh, you're too modest. Clara dear, you must be pleased to have captured Mr. Hale's attention. He's been so withdrawn since his tragedy, it's wonderful to see him socializing again." The words were kindly meant, but they landed like stones. Garrett felt himself tensing, walls starting to rebuild. But before he could retreat into cold politeness, Clara's voice cut through. "Mr. Hale doesn't need to be captured, Mrs. Henderson. He's perfectly capable of making his own choices about when and how he socializes. And frankly, I think he's been remarkably patient with everyone treating his grief like public property." Her tone was pleasant but steel-edged. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I promise to show him Mrs. Patterson's rose garden." She took Garrett's arm and steered him away before Mrs. Henderson could respond. They walked in silence until they were well clear of the crowd, into the actual rose garden that bordered the property. "I'm sorry," Clara said when they were alone. "I probably shouldn't have said that, but the way she talked about you, like you're some sort of project to be fixed, it made me angry." "You defended me again." "Someone needs to. You're too polite to tell people to mind their own business, even when they desperately need to hear it." She turned to face him. "Garrett, I need you to know. I'm not here because I think you need fixing. I'm here because I like you. The actual you, not some imaginary healed version. You're allowed to still be grieving. You're allowed to have bad days. You're allowed to be complicated and difficult and occasionally impossible." The words broke something loose in Garrett's chest. For 5 years, everyone had treated his grief like a disease to be cured, a problem to be solved. Even Pete and Maria, who loved him, wanted him to move on, to heal, to become who he'd been before. But Clara wasn't asking him to change. She was accepting him as he was, broken pieces and all. "Why?" The question came out raw. "Why do you care? You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you're kind even when it costs you. I know you work yourself to exhaustion because it's easier than thinking. I know you defend people who can't defend themselves. I know you keep your word even when it terrifies you." Clara stepped closer. "And I know what it's like to be so afraid of getting hurt again that you'd rather feel nothing. But Garrett, feeling nothing isn't living. It's just surviving. And we both deserve more than that." There it was again, that insistence that they deserved more, that merely surviving wasn't enough. Clara believed it with her whole heart, and standing in the fading light with roses blooming around them, Garrett found himself starting to believe it too. "I don't know how," he admitted. "I've been numb for so long I don't know how to feel things again without it destroying me." "You don't have to know how. You just have to be willing to try." Clara's voice was gentle but insistent. "One step at a time, one moment at a time. You came to this party, that was brave. You danced with me, that was braver. Maybe tomorrow you try something else that scares you, and the day after, something else. Until eventually, living doesn't feel quite so terrifying. And if I fail, if I try and can't do it, then you fail, and you try again, or you don't. But at least you'll have tried, instead of spending the rest of your life wondering what might have been possible if you'd been brave enough to reach for it." Garrett looked at her, really looked at her. This remarkable woman who'd walked into his life and refused to accept his carefully constructed walls. She was asking him to take a leap of faith, to trust that something good might still be possible, to believe that his heart, broken as it was, could still feel something beyond grief. It was terrifying. It was impossible. It was exactly what he needed to hear. "I want to try," he said finally, the words costing him everything. "I don't know if I can, but I want to try." Clara's smile was brilliant. "That's all I need. Just your willingness to try." She reached for his hand and Garrett let her take it. Let himself feel the warmth of her palm against his, the gentle pressure of her fingers. Let himself acknowledge that this, whatever this was between them, mattered.
They stood there in the rose garden as twilight deepened into night, hands linked, neither speaking. There were no grand declarations, no promises of forever, just two wounded people choosing to be brave together, to take one small step toward healing. And for now, that was enough. The party continued around them, but Garrett found he no longer cared about the crowd or the whispers or the expectations. Clara was beside him, solid and real, and her presence made everything else fade into insignificance. Eventually, they returned to the gathering. Mayor Hutchins cornered Garrett to discuss water rights. Mrs. Patterson introduced Clara to more potential clients. The band played on, couples danced, and Silver Ridge society did what it always did, gossiped and judged and speculated. But something fundamental had shifted. Garrett could feel it in the way he moved through the crowd, no longer desperate to escape, in the way he actually listened when people spoke to him, in the way his eyes kept finding Clara across the lawn, and the warmth that spread through his chest each time she smiled at him. He was still damaged, still grieving, still carrying wounds that might never fully heal. But for the first time in 5 years, he felt like maybe, just maybe, those wounds didn't have to define him forever. As the evening wore on and guests began departing, Clara found him again. "You survived," she said with a tired but genuine smile. "Barely. But you did. And that's what matters." She glanced toward where her rented carriage waited. "I should go. It's been a long day, and I have work tomorrow. I'll walk you to your carriage." They moved through the thinning crowd, saying goodbyes to Mrs. Patterson and other prominent guests. When they reached Clara's carriage, Garrett helped her up, his hand lingering on hers perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Thank you for coming," Clara said from her seat. "It meant more than you know." "Thank you for asking me, for everything you said tonight, about trying, about deserving more. I meant every word." "I know. That's what makes it matter." Clara's expression softened. "Good night, Garrett. I'll see you soon?" It was a question, hopeful and hesitant. Garrett thought about his ranch, his whiskey, his comfortable numbness. Then he thought about Clara's laugh, her stubbornness, her unwavering belief that they both deserved happiness. "You'll see me soon," he confirmed. "I promise." He watched her carriage roll away into the darkness, then mounted his own horse and rode home under a sky full of stars. The night air was cool and clear, carrying the scent of sage and pine. Familiar country, the land he'd lived on all his life. But something about it felt different now, new somehow, despite being exactly the same. Pete was waiting when he got back, pretending to check on the horses, but clearly just waiting for a report. "How'd it go?" the old foreman asked. "It went," Garrett said, dismounting. "I survived." "You do more than survive?" Garrett considered the question, thought about dancing with Clara, about her hand in his, about the way she'd looked at him like he was worth something beyond his tragedy. "Maybe," he said finally. "I'm starting to think maybe I did." Pete grinned. "About damn time." In his house, Maria had left a lamp burning and a plate of food covered on the table. Garrett ate mechanically, his mind replaying the evening, the dance, the conversation in the rose garden, the feeling of Clara's hand in his. He should have been terrified, should have been planning how to rebuild his walls, how to protect himself from the vulnerability he'd allowed. But as he prepared for bed, all he felt was a strange, tentative hope. Maybe Clara was right. Maybe they did deserve more than just surviving. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally brave enough to reach for it. That night, Garrett dreamed of Sarah again. But this time, she wasn't sad or accusing. She was smiling, that warm, knowing smile she'd always had when he was being stubborn. "It's okay," dreamed Sarah said. "It's okay to be happy again. It's okay to live. I want you to live, Garrett. Really live, not just exist." When he woke, tears were streaming down his face. But they weren't tears of grief this time. They were tears of release, of finally giving himself permission to feel something beyond loss. The sun was just rising, painting his room in shades of gold. Garrett lay there for a moment, feeling the warmth of the light, the softness of his bed, the steady beat of his heart. He was alive, still damaged, still grieving, but undeniably, impossibly alive. And for the first time in 5 years, that felt like enough. Being alive, Garrett discovered over the following days, was considerably more complicated than merely surviving. Surviving had rules, patterns, safe boundaries. Being alive meant venturing into unknown territory where anything could happen and frequently did. He started small. The morning after the party, instead of throwing himself immediately into work, he sat on his porch with coffee and actually watched the sunrise. Really watched it, the way he used to before grief had stolen his ability to notice beauty. The mountains caught fire with light, gold bleeding into pink, bleeding into deep orange, and Garrett felt something stir in his chest that wasn't pain. Maria found him there 20 minutes later, still holding his empty coffee cup, still staring at the horizon. "You feeling all right?" she asked, concerned. "I'm watching the sunrise." "I can see that, but you've been sitting there awful still. I thought maybe you'd fallen asleep with your eyes open." Plus, Garrett looked at her, and for the first time in recent memory, he smiled without forcing it. "I forgot how beautiful it is. The sunrise. I used to watch it every morning, but somewhere along the way I stopped seeing it." Maria's expression softened with understanding. "And now you're seeing it again." "Yeah, I think I am." She patted his shoulder, said nothing more, and went back inside. But Garrett caught the tears in her eyes and knew what they meant. She'd been waiting 5 years for him to come back to life. And here, finally, were the first real signs that he might be trying. The next step was harder. That afternoon, Garrett rode to the hillside where Sarah and his son were buried. He hadn't been there in months, couldn't bear it usually. But Clara's words echoed in his mind, one step at a time, one moment at a time. The graves were well tended despite his absence. Maria came here weekly, he knew, keeping the grass trimmed and leaving fresh flowers. Today there were wildflowers in a simple jar, their colors bright against the weathered headstones. Garrett dismounted and stood before the graves, hat in hand, trying to find words. For long minutes, nothing came. Then, haltingly, he began to speak. "Sarah, I don't know if you can hear me. Don't know if there's anything after, if you're somewhere watching, but if you are, I need you to know something." He paused, swallowing hard. "I met someone. Her name's Clara. She's not you. Nobody could be you. But she's remarkable in her own way, and she makes me feel things I thought I'd never feel again. And I'm terrified, Sarah. Terrified of dishonoring your memory. Terrified of opening my heart and having it destroyed again. But I'm also tired of being half dead. Tired of just existing." The wind picked up, rustling through the oak leaves above the graves. Garrett took it as permission to continue. "I loved you. God, I loved you so much. And our boy. I barely got to know him, but I loved him too. That love doesn't go away just because I'm trying to live again. It's part of me now, woven into who I am. But Clara says I deserve more than just surviving, and I think maybe she's right. I think maybe you'd want that for me too." His voice broke, and he stood there crying for the first time in years. Not the silent, dry-eyed grief he'd carried like a stone. Real tears, messy and painful and somehow cleansing. "I'm going to try," he told Sarah's grave. "I'm going to try to be happy again. And I need you to know, it doesn't mean I'm forgetting you. It just means I'm finally ready to keep living. To honor you by actually living, not by building a shrine to suffering." He stayed there for an hour, talking to his wife's memory, telling her about Clara, about the party, about the terrifying hope that had taken root in his chest. And when he finally left, riding back down the hillside toward the ranch, he felt lighter. Not healed. Healing would take far longer, but lighter. That evening, he wrote Clara a letter. It took him 6 attempts and nearly an hour to get it right. His handwriting awkward from disuse. The final version was simple, direct, and more honest than he'd been with anyone in years. "Dear Clara, I wanted to thank you properly for asking me to attend the party, and for what you said in the rose garden. You were right. I have been just surviving, and it's time I tried to do more than that. I don't know what this means or where it goes, but I'd like to see you again. Not for business reasons, just to see you. If you're willing, yours, Garrett." He sent it with Tommy the next morning, trying not to pace nervously while he waited for a response. It came 2 days later, delivered by a grinning Tommy who clearly knew something was developing and was invested in its success. Claire's handwriting was elegant, confident, much like her. Dear Garrett, I'm more than willing. In fact, I've been hoping you'd ask. There's a picnic spot by Willow Creek that Mrs. Henderson told me about. She says it's beautiful this time of year. Would you meet me there on Sunday afternoon? I'll bring lunch. We can talk. Or not talk, whatever feels right. Yours, Clara. Sunday felt impossibly far away. Garrett threw himself into work, but for once it wasn't to avoid thinking. It was because he had something to look forward to, and staying busy made the time pass faster. His men noticed the change immediately. Boss seems different, Murphy remarked to Rodriguez while they were mending fence. Garrett, working alongside them, pretended not to hear. Different how? Rodriguez asked. Lighter, I guess. Less like he's carrying the world on his shoulders. You think it's because of Miss Wynne? Has to be. Man goes to one party with a pretty lady and suddenly remembers how to smile. It's about time, if you ask me. Nobody asked you, Garrett said without heat. And I can hear you, you know. The men grinned unrepentantly. We're just glad to see it, boss, Murphy said. You've been walking around like a ghost for too long. Nice to have the real you back. The real you. Was this the real him, or was the real Garrett Hale the grieving widower who'd buried himself in work and whiskey? Maybe, Garrett thought, there wasn't one real version. Maybe he was all of it. The man he'd been before loss, the man grief had made him, and the man he was slowly becoming. All of it real, all of it him. Sunday arrived with perfect weather, warm but not hot, a light breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and pine. Garrett took more care with his appearance than he had in years, changing shirts twice before settling on a simple blue cotton that Maria assured him looked nice. He felt ridiculous, primping like a courting boy, but he couldn't seem to help himself. The ride to Willow Creek was familiar. He'd fished there as a boy, had brought Sarah here in their early courting days. The memories should have hurt, should have made this feel wrong, but as he approached and saw Clara sitting on a blanket by the water, her hair loose around her shoulders and her face lit with anticipation, the past and present seemed to coexist peacefully. You came, she said as he dismounted, echoing her words from the party. Said I would. I know, but I was still half convinced you'd change your mind. She gestured to the blanket spread with food. I wasn't sure what you liked, so I brought a bit of everything. Fried chicken, fresh bread, cheese, apple pie that Maria was kind enough to make when I asked her advice. You went to Maria? I did. She was very helpful. Also very pointed in her comments about how happy she is that you're finally living again, as she put it. Clara smiled. Your housekeeper is not subtle about her matchmaking. No, Garrett agreed, settling onto the blanket. She's not. I hope she didn't pressure you or Garrett! Clara's hand found his, stopping the worried words. I'm here because I want to be. Not because Maria encouraged me, not because I feel obligated, but because I genuinely enjoy your company and want to spend time with you. Can you believe that? He looked at their joined hands, at the way her fingers laced naturally with his, and felt that now familiar flutter in his chest. I'm trying to. Then keep trying. That's all I ask. They ate in comfortable silence at first, then talked about easy things, the ranch, her shop, the latest town gossip. Clara told him about Mrs. Pemberton's horror at discovering her daughter wanted to wear practical bloomers instead of traditional skirts, and Garrett found himself actually laughing at her impression of the scandalized woman. You're good at that, he said. The mimicry. Do you do everyone? Only the ones who deserve it. Clara's eyes sparkled with mischief. Should I do you? God, no, I don't want to know how I sound. You sound fine. Deep voice, not many words, but when you do speak, people listen because they know it matters. She tilted her head, studying him. You're not a man who wastes words on nothing. Never saw the point. My father used to say if you can't say something worth hearing, better to stay quiet. Wise advice. Though sometimes I think I talk too much to fill silences. You don't talk too much. You're just alive, present, engaged with the world. Garrett struggled for the right words. I forgot how to do that. But watching you, listening to you, it reminds me that being quiet doesn't have to mean being dead inside. Clara's expression turned serious. Is that how you felt? Dead inside? For a long time, yes. Grief isn't
It's not just sadness. It's this crushing weight that makes everything gray and flat. Food has no taste. Music has no meaning. Beauty exists, but you can't feel it. You just go through motions because you don't know what else to do. And now? Garrett looked at her, at the way sunlight caught in her auburn hair, at the genuine care in her green eyes. Now I'm starting to feel things again. And it's terrifying because feeling anything means feeling everything, the grief, the guilt, the fear. But also joy, hope, possibility. That's brave, Clara said softly. Choosing to feel even when it hurts. You said something similar at the party, about being brave enough to try. Did you think about what I said? About deserving more than just surviving? I've thought about little else. Garrett's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, the gesture unconscious and intimate. I went to Sarah's grave, talked to her for the first time in months, told her about you, about trying to live again, and I think she'd approve. I think she'd want me to be happy. Claire's eyes glistened with tears. Of course she would. If she loved you, and I'm certain she did, she'd want you to have a full life, not a half-life spent mourning. That's what I'm realizing, that honoring her memory doesn't mean staying frozen in grief. It means living the kind of life she would have wanted for me. They sat in silence for a moment, hands still joined, the creek burbling softly beside them. Then Clara asked the question Garrett had been both expecting and dreading. What happens now, between us, I mean? It was the question he'd been asking himself for days. What did happen now? What did he want to happen? The old Garrett would have retreated, built walls, protected himself from the vulnerability of caring. But he was trying to be different now, trying to be brave. I don't know, he admitted. I care about you, Clara, more than I thought I'd ever care about anyone again. But I'm damaged, still grieving, still figuring out how to live instead of just survive. I don't know if I'm ready for whatever this is. And if I said I don't need you to be ready, that I'm willing to take this as slowly as you need, that I'm not asking for promises or declarations, just your honest company, then I'd say you're either remarkably patient or slightly crazy. Clara laughed, the sound bright and clear. Maybe both. But Garrett, I meant what I said. I'm not here to fix you or heal you or replace what you lost. I'm here because when I'm with you, I feel seen, known, like I can be honest about my own fears and struggles without being judged. You give me that gift, whether you realize it or not. What fears? Garrett asked, curious. You seem so confident, so sure of yourself. I'm terrified most of the time, Clara confessed. Terrified my business will fail. Terrified I'll never measure up to what people expect. Terrified I'll spend my whole life alone because I'm too stubborn and independent for most men to handle. But with you, you don't seem threatened by my independence. You respect it. That's rarer than you know. Your independence is part of what I... Garrett caught himself, the word he'd almost said hanging unspoken between them. Love. He'd almost said love. Too soon. Far too soon. What I admire about you, he finished carefully. But Clara had heard the hesitation, seen what he'd stopped himself from saying. Her expression softened, and she squeezed his hand gently. It's okay, she said. Whatever you're feeling, at whatever pace you're feeling it, it's okay. We don't have to name it or define it or make it into something it's not ready to be. Can we just be together? See where this goes without forcing it? Relief flooded through Garrett. Yes. God, yes, that's exactly what I need. Then that's what we'll do. Clara smiled. No expectations, no timelines, just two people choosing to spend time together and seeing what develops. They spent the rest of the afternoon by the creek, talking and laughing and occasionally falling into comfortable silences. Clara told him about growing up in Boston, about her complicated relationship with her father, about the fiancé she'd lost, and the guilt she still carried over not being sure she'd loved him enough. Garrett shared more about Sarah, about their courtship and marriage, about the grief that had nearly destroyed him. It should have been painful, these conversations about loss and love and fear, but somehow sharing it with Clara made it bearable. She didn't try to fix him or minimize his pain. She just listened, understood, and offered her own experiences in return.
It was the most honest conversation Garrett had experienced in years, and when the sun began to sink toward the horizon, he realized hours had passed without him noticing. "I should get back," Clara said reluctantly. "I have an early commission tomorrow. I'll ride with you." They packed up the picnic supplies together, working in harmony, and Garrett felt a pang of regret that the afternoon was ending. But as they mounted their horses and began the ride back toward town, Clara smiled at him in a way that suggested this was a beginning, not an ending. "Same time next week?" she asked as they reached the edge of Silver Ridge. "I'd like that." "Good, because I already have plans for what we could do. There's a trail Mrs. Patterson mentioned that supposedly has the most beautiful views." "You're planning our future outings?" "Someone has to, or you'll spend a week overthinking and convince yourself you shouldn't come." Clara's tone was teasing, but knowing. "Am I wrong?" "No," Garrett admitted. "You're not wrong." "Then let me handle the planning, and you just show up. Can you do that?" "I can do that." They parted with a promise to see each other Sunday, and Garrett rode home with a lightness in his chest that felt foreign and wonderful. Pete was waiting at the barn, his expression carefully neutral. "Good afternoon?" the foreman asked. "Very good. You gonna see her again?" "Next Sunday." Pete's weathered face broke into a grin. "About damn time you started courting properly instead of dancing around it." "We're not courting," Garrett protested. "We're just spending time together." "Call it whatever makes you comfortable, boss. But that woman's got you smiling again, and that's worth more than all the cattle in Colorado." The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Garrett worked the ranch during the week, but Sundays became sacred, his time with Clara. They explored trails around Silver Ridge, picnicked by various creeks and meadows, and talked about everything and nothing. Sometimes they'd go to Clara's shop, and Garrett would help with design problems or offer opinions on new projects. Other times Clara would come to the ranch, and he'd show her around, introducing her to the horses and explaining the business of ranching. She was a quick study, asking intelligent questions and offering unexpected insights. When he mentioned struggling with water rights negotiations with a neighboring rancher, she suggested a compromise solution he hadn't considered. When one of his mares had a difficult delivery, Clara stayed up all night with him, holding the lantern and offering quiet support while Doc Patterson and Garrett worked to save both mother and foal. "You didn't have to stay," Garrett told her afterward, both of them exhausted but relieved as the foal nursed for the first time. "I wanted to. This is your life, your world. If we're going to, whatever we're doing, I want to understand it. Most women wouldn't be interested in the messy reality of ranching. I'm not most women." Clara's smile was tired but genuine. "Besides, I like seeing you in your element. You're good at this, Garrett. Really good. You care about your animals, your land, your people. That matters." The town noticed, of course. Silver Ridge being what it was, people talked. Some with approval, some with skepticism, some with the kind of knowing speculation that made Garrett's jaw tighten. But Clara handled it all with remarkable grace, neither confirming nor denying the relationship, just going about her business with her head held high. "They're saying we're courting," Garrett told her one Sunday as they sat by Willow Creek again, this now their favorite spot. "I know, Mrs. Pemberton cornered me at the Mercantile to express her concerns about my reputation." "What did you tell her?" "That my reputation is my own business, and I'll manage it as I see fit." Clara's eyes sparkled. She was not pleased. "But honestly, Garrett, I don't care what they say. Do you?" He considered the question. A few months ago, the answer would have been yes. He'd have cared desperately, would have let town gossip drive his decisions. But now, with Clara beside him and genuine happiness within reach, other people's opinions seemed less important. "No," he said, "I don't care. As long as you're happy, as long as I'm not damaging your business or your standing, you're not. If anything, having the approval of the county's most successful rancher has helped my business. I've had 3 new commissions this week alone, all because someone saw us together and decided I must be respectable if you're courting me." "But we're not." Garrett paused. Were they courting? They spent every Sunday together. They wrote letters during the week. He thought about her constantly, and judging by the way she looked at him, she thought about him too. What else would you call that? Clara seemed to read his thoughts. "What do you want to call it?" she asked gently. "I don't know. Courting it feels like making promises about the future, and you're not ready to make promises. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. The admission hurt, but it was honest. I care about you, Clara, more than I thought possible. But the idea of marriage, of building another life with someone, his throat tightened. What if I lose you too? There it was, the fear that had been lurking beneath everything else. Not that he couldn't love again, but that he couldn't survive losing again. Garrett had barely survived losing Sarah and his son. If he opened his heart fully to Clara and then lost her, to illness, to accident, to any of the 1,000 things that could go wrong, he didn't think he'd come back from it. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her hand finding his. "Can't promise you won't lose me," she said finally. "None of us can promise that. Life is uncertain and often cruel." But Garrett, if you let fear of loss prevent you from living, from loving, then you're already lost. You're already letting grief win. I know that logically, but knowing and feeling are different things. They are. Clara turned to face him fully. So let me ask you something. Are you happier now than you were 6 months ago?
Yes. Do you think about me during the week? Look forward to Sundays? You know I do. When you're with me, do you feel alive, present, like yourself? Yes. The word came out rough with emotion. Then isn't that worth something? Even if we can't know what the future holds, isn't the present worth experiencing? Clara's eyes held his. I'm not asking you to marry me, Garrett. I'm not asking for promises about forever. I'm just asking if you can accept what we have right now, in this moment, and let that be enough. Could he? Could he accept happiness without guarantees? Could he love because he was starting to realize that's what this was? Without the certainty of forever? What if it's not enough for you? He asked. What if you want more than I can give? Then we'll figure it out when we get there. But right now, this is enough. You are enough. The words broke something open in Garrett's chest. You are enough. Not you would be enough if you healed completely. Not you'll be enough someday. But you, right now, with all your damage and fear and uncertainty, you are enough. He pulled Clara into his arms without thinking, holding her close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. She held him back just as tightly, her face pressed into his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other. I'm falling in love with you, Garrett whispered into her hair. And it terrifies me. Clara pulled back enough to look at him, tears shining in her eyes. I'm falling in love with you too. And I'm terrified too. But I'd rather be terrified and alive than safe and empty. He kissed her then, unable not to. It was gentle and tentative and tasted of tears and hope. Clara kissed him back, her hands coming up to frame his face, and for those few moments, nothing else existed except the two of them and this fragile, beautiful thing they were building together. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against Clara's. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted. Neither do I. But we'll figure it out together. The summer deepened into early fall, and Garrett found himself settling into a new rhythm. Work still filled his days, but it no longer felt like an escape. It felt like purpose, building something, maintaining something, creating something that mattered. And his Sundays with Clara became the highlight of every week, the thing he looked forward to with an anticipation that was both thrilling and slightly terrifying. They were careful in public, aware of the scrutiny but no longer obsessed with it. In private, they were learning each other, Clara's tendency to work too late and forget to eat, Garrett's habit of overthinking every decision, the way they both used humor to deflect when emotions got too intense. There were difficult days too, times when Garrett would retreat into old patterns of grief and Clara would have to decide whether to push or give him space. Times when Clara's insecurities about her business or her worth would surface and Garrett would struggle to find the right words to reassure her. But they kept showing up, kept choosing each other, kept being brave even when it was hard. It was Pete who finally forced the question Garrett had been avoiding. Boss, you need to make a decision, the foreman said one October morning. They were preparing the cattle for winter, organizing the herd and planning feed supplies. About what? About Miss Wynne. You've been courting her for near 4 months now. People are starting to wonder if you're serious or just playing at it. Garrett's jaw tightened.
What people think is none of my concern. Maybe not. But what Miss Wynne thinks should be. She's a good woman, Garrett. Respectable, talented, kind. But she's also got pride. How long do you think she'll accept a relationship that has no direction, no future? We've talked about this. She understands I need time. Time for what? To decide if you love her? Boss, you're already in love with her. Anyone with eyes can see it. The question isn't whether you love her, it's whether you're brave enough to do something about it. The words hit harder than Garrett wanted to admit. Pete was right. He did love Clara, had loved her for weeks, maybe months. But loving her and committing to a future with her were different things. One was feeling, the other was action. What if I'm not ready? He asked quietly. Then you're not ready. But don't string her along while you figure it out. Either commit to building something with her or set her free to find someone who will. That's the decent thing to do. Pete walked away, leaving Garrett standing in the corral, his mind churning. Was he stringing Clara along? They'd agreed to take things slowly, to let the relationship develop without pressure. But maybe slow had turned into stagnant. Maybe Clara was waiting for him to make some kind of move, some indication that this was going somewhere beyond pleasant Sundays and careful conversations. That night, Garrett did something he hadn't done in years. He went to his bedroom closet and pulled out a small wooden box from the back shelf. Inside were Sarah's things, her wedding ring, a locket he'd given her, the baby clothes she'd been sewing when the fever took her. He sat on the bed, holding her wedding ring, and let himself remember. Not with the crushing grief that had defined the past 5 years, but with gentle nostalgia. Sarah had been his first love, his wife, the mother of his child. That would always matter, that would always be part of who he was. But she was gone, and he was still here, still living, still breathing, still capable of love. I think I'm ready, he told the empty room. I think I'm ready to try again, to build something new. Is that okay? No answer came, of course, but in the silence, Garrett felt a sense of peace settle over him. Sarah was gone, but she wouldn't want him to spend his life as a living memorial to grief. She'd want him to be happy, to love again, to live fully. And Clara, remarkable, stubborn, brave Clara, was offering him that chance. The next Sunday, Garrett arrived at their meeting spot by Willow Creek with a plan. He'd been up half the night, thinking and worrying and eventually deciding. Now he just had to find the courage to follow through. Clara was already there, spreading out their usual picnic blanket. She looked up as he approached, her smile bright and welcoming. "You're late," she teased. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten." "Never. I needed some time to think about what I wanted to say." Something in his tone made Clara's expression turn serious. "That sounds ominous. Should I be worried?" "No, at least I hope not." Garrett dismounted, his heart hammering. "Clara, we need to talk about us, about what this is and where it's going." Clara folded her hands in her lap, her composure perfect, but her eyes worried. "All right, I'm listening." Garrett had rehearsed this speech a dozen times, but now that the moment was here, every word fled his mind. He stood there struggling until Clara's gentle voice broke through his panic. "Garrett, whatever you need to say, just say it. Honestly, I can handle it. I love you." The words burst out, raw and unpolished. "I'm in love with you, and it scares the hell out of me because I never thought I'd feel this way again. But I do. And I think I'm ready to stop being scared and start being brave." Clara's breath caught, her eyes widening. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want more than Sundays. I want a future with you. Not right now, not tomorrow, but eventually. I want to court you properly, with the intention of marriage. If you'll have me. If you're willing to take a chance on a damaged man who's still figuring out how to live." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, but she was smiling. "You're not damaged, Garrett. You're healing. There's a difference. I'm trying to heal. With you. Because of you." He dropped to one knee, taking her hands in his. "I can't promise I won't have bad days. Can't promise I won't sometimes retreat into old fears. But I can promise I'll keep trying. Keep choosing you. Keep being brave enough to reach for the happiness we both deserve. If you'll let me." "Oh, Garrett." Clara pulled him up into her arms, holding him tight. "Yes, of course, yes. I love you too. So much. And I'll take all of you, the healed parts and the healing parts, and the parts that might never fully heal, all of it. They held each other by the creek, both crying, both laughing, both feeling the weight of fear and grief starting to lift. It wasn't gone completely, might never be gone completely. But it was lighter now, made bearable by shared love and stubborn hope. When they finally pulled apart, Garrett cupped Clara's face in his hands, marveling at the trust in her eyes. I don't have a ring yet. Haven't even planned what I want to say properly. But Clara Wynne, will you marry me? Someday, when we're both ready, will you build a life with me? Yes. Clara's smile was radiant through her tears. Yes to all of it, to someday, to building a life, to everything. He kissed her then, deep and sure, pouring every ounce of love and gratitude and hope into it. Clara kissed him back with equal fervor, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathless and grinning. We're really doing this, Clara said, wonder in her voice. We're really doing this. People are going to talk. Let them talk. Your men are going to be insufferable with their I told you so's. They've earned it. Garrett pulled her close again, resting his chin on top of her head. Thank you. For what? For being patient, for being brave when I couldn't be, for showing me that living is worth the risk of losing. He paused. For bringing me back to life. You brought yourself back, Clara corrected gently. I just walked beside you while you did it. They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans. Tentative, flexible plans that acknowledged they were both still figuring things out. Clara would keep her shop. Garrett would keep his ranch. They'd marry next spring, after the winter was past and the world was green again. Something small, they agreed. Just close friends and family, nothing elaborate. But even as they planned practical details, Garrett felt something deeper settling into place. A sense of rightness, of future, of possibility. The ride back to town that evening felt different. They rode slowly, hands occasionally touching, talking easily about everything and nothing. And when they reached the edge of Silver Ridge where they usually parted, Garrett found himself reluctant to let her go. Come to dinner at the ranch tomorrow, he said. Maria will be thrilled, and I want everyone to know about us, about our plans. You're ready for that? I'm ready to stop hiding, stop letting fear make my decisions. He squeezed her hand. I'm ready to live, Clara, really live, with you. Her smile was everything. Then I'll be there. The news spread through Silver Ridge like wildfire. By the time Garrett arrived home, Pete already knew. Tommy had seen them by the creek and ridden ahead with the news. The old foreman was waiting on the porch, grinning like a fool. Heard you finally came to your senses, Pete said. Heard correctly. About damn time. The men have been placing bets for weeks on when you'd propose. We're not actually engaged yet, not officially, just promised to each other. Close enough, Pete clapped him on the shoulder. She's good for you, boss. Sarah would approve. The words, which might have hurt months ago, now felt like benediction. I think she would too. That night, Garrett stood on his porch one last time as a man alone. Tomorrow, Clara would come to dinner and meet his household properly. Next week, they'd tell Mrs. Patterson and start the social rounds of announcing their intentions. And next spring, if all went well, he'd stand at an altar and promise his life to someone again. It should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and infinite. Somewhere in the house behind him, Maria was singing as she prepared for bed. From the bunkhouse came the sound of his men laughing over cards. His ranch, his land, his life, all of it still here, still solid, but now filled with possibility instead of just duty. Garrett thought of Clara, probably lying in her own bed in town, thinking about him. Thought of their future, uncertain in details but sure in direction. Thought of all the moments yet to come, wedding vows and shared meals and quiet evenings and challenges faced together. And for the first time in 5 long years, Garrett Hale smiled at the night sky and felt genuine, uncomplicated happiness. The cowboy who'd buried his heart with his wife and child had found it again, not in forgetting them, but in honoring their memory by living fully. Clara's smile had indeed broken through his defenses, but it had done more than that. It had reminded him that love wasn't a finite resource to be hoarded and protected. It was infinite, renewable, capable of encompassing both past and future. He would always love Sarah, would always mourn what they'd lost, but he could also love Clara, could build a new life while honoring the old one, could be both a widower and a husband-to-be, both grieving and hopeful, both wounded and healing. As he finally went inside, Garrett carried that knowledge with him like a lantern in the dark. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Next week, its own complications. But for tonight, standing on the threshold of a new beginning, he allowed himself to simply feel grateful. Grateful for survival, grateful for healing, grateful for the stubborn, remarkable woman who'd refused to let him hide in his grief forever, and most of all, grateful for the courage, hers and his, to reach for happiness even when it had seemed impossible. The story that people would tell for years to come wasn't just about a cowboy and the woman whose smile broke through his defenses. It was about two wounded people choosing to be brave together, about love that honored the past while embracing the future, about the truth that sometimes the right person doesn't just warm